I will turn it over to Cheryl to say the official welcome. So thank you, Dean Holcomb-Moore.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Should I do this? Okay. Good afternoon. That's better, right? Yes. All right. Well, welcome to the School of Education, everyone, and thank you, Cynthia, for the nice introduction and for including me in this wonderful event. I have to say, one of the highlights of my year is welcoming the many practitioners and advocates and researchers to our Global Ed Forum. And I want to just, at this moment, give a special thank you to Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idris and her wonderful staff that are here today that made this event possible. If those folks would just please stand, because without you, we would not have this wonderful event. So please stand and let's give them a round of applause. In the School of Education, we see ourselves as a national leader in global education issues here at American University because of our outstanding faculty and staff and leaders here at American University. And this year's theme, Hate Comes to Campus, sadly is as timely as ever. Issues of free speech, hate incidents, and the radical right on college campuses, this campus included, are the topics of discussion as racial and hate incidents continue to rise across the country and across the globe. And I anticipate today, I look forward to hearing the many ideas that our esteemed panelists have about how our thoughts should be framed and what the future looks like for us and how we must fight back. And so I really look forward to this time together because it's sorely needed. Here at American University, what we really look forward to, there is not one answer to this issue. But what we look forward to here at American University is bringing a collective group of professionals together in convening in the hopes of creating some solutions. And as I said, fighting back, I think is needed more than ever before. So I look forward to, at the end of this day today, after hearing two panels with, I think, the experts in this topic that will give us a sense of where we need to go. We might even have an action plan for how we are going to build a scholarly base as well as a practitioner base for this work. So I look forward to learning more from you about how we can do that here at American universities and at other universities across the globe. I also want to take some time to thank other sponsors that made this day possible, and without these folks, we would not have the ability to be here and to have live streaming and to have so many people join us. And so I want to thank and recognize PEN America for your work. PEN America has co-sponsored this event. They are a group that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. And so I really want to thank you. And if those folks from PEN America, if you would just show your hand so we can thank you accordingly for all of your work. Thank you. In addition to PEN America, I also want to thank another co-sponsor from Rant Media. I'm not sure if anyone is here in the room from Rant Media. Thank you. He's there with our live streaming. Thank you. Rant Media, give them a hand. Also, the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right from the UK, if they're here. Yes, thank you. And we will have representation on the second panel from them. And also the School of Public Affairs here, our colleagues here at American University from the Project on Civil Discourse, and they are here on the panel. Let's give them a hand. Thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our speaker and our panel, our facilitator. And once again, thank you so much for being here today. And I will apologize that I will have to skip out for a meeting. I hope I can get back. I don't know, but the meeting that I'm going to, I won't tell you where I'm going, but probably not get back because it's going to probably go over. But I look forward to hearing more about your discussions today, and again, looking forward to plans of action for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I want to just quickly welcome our distinguished panelists here, Dr. Ibram Kendi from American University, Professor Laura Schwartz, and Professor Shannon Gilreath, who's come to us from Wake Forest University in North Carolina. The topic of hate on campus is one that should be alarming to everyone in the United States today. We have seen an incredible increase in hate-motivated crimes, hateful speech, hateful incidents across numerous college campuses, and it reflects also the emergence of hateful groups off campus as well. So just some statistics to help set and begin the conversation. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, hate groups in recent years have proliferated. 917 is the number they reported in 2016. That jumped to over 1,020 in 2018. They reported that the number of neo-Nazi groups has soared by 22%. The number of anti-Muslim groups has increased every year in the past 3 years. Has increased. Data from the FBI similarly shows that hate crimes are on the rise. In 2017 compared to 2016, there was a 17% rise overall, a 16% rise in anti-Black crimes, a 37% rise in anti-Jewish crimes, a 66% rise in crimes against people with disabilities, and a 48% rise in crimes motivated by gender bias. If we look at the statistics from the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, anti-Semitic incidents are also surging. They grew by 60% in 2017, which was the largest single-year increase on record, as long as they've been reporting this data. The ADL has also reported a spike in white supremacist propaganda, growing in 2018. It grew from 2017 an increase of 182%. So we're way past 100%, more than almost doubling. And if these statistics were not alarming enough, according to the Department of Justice, when we think about hate crimes, we also have to recognize that many go unreported, both on campus and off. So, some sobering numbers for us all to consider. As we start to think about the question of hate on campus and what we do about it, clearly one of the topics that's gotten a lot of attention is the question of speech, free speech, hate speech. Humor, I thought we would start with you. For the question, we have this old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You've written about the importance of understanding the history of racism in the United States and how it informs what's happening today. I was wondering if you could share some reflections about that statement, about sticks and stones. Has this changed in the current moment?
Well, I just, first would like to thank you all for coming this afternoon, and I'm excited to share in this conversation. I think that, this concept of, sticks and stones may not hurt you is true, but then again, someone who is infected with bigotry can pick up a gun and hurt you. And so I think that, and that historically has happened, in this country. I mean, to a large extent, the history of America from a racial standpoint is the history of white terrorism. And so I think, and many of those people were driven by forms of anti-Black or anti-Native or anti-Asian, and many different sort of forms of bigotry. And people essentially are not born mass murderers. People consume ideas. They're led to believe that the problems of their society, that the problems of their own community, the problems of their own family stem from other people. And they're taught that those people are dangerous. And they typically want to sort of protect themselves by attacking those very people. And sort of the source of that is racist ideas.
So would you say it's possible to separate, hateful speech from hateful action? Can we, in our minds, think of treating them differently in the law or in with regard to the justice, and how we treat these and how we remedy them, or are they entwined?
So I think, for instance, if a lot of the speech that everyday people, a lot of the ideas that everyday people consume have largely been uttered by people who are public officials who have massive platforms. And of course, as a nation, we have allowed anyone to say anything and call that free speech. But I think one of the things we may need to reconsider is it practical and is it endangering people when we allow public officials to say speech that is both false and dangerous with the specific intent of mobilizing people to think that the problem is other people as opposed to their very policies that they are sort of instituting. And so for me, I distinguish between free speech and unfree speech. To me, unfree speech is speech that is both dangerous and false. And bigotry falls right along those lines.
Laura, I'm going to turn to you next. With regard to the concept of hate speech, you've heard before, about the ways in which it can be difficult for legal experts to weigh in on the concept of hate speech. You've heard before that it's meaningless constitutionally and useless as a community standard when thinking about college campuses dealing with these issues. Could you talk a little bit about how you view hate speech and what you meant?
Sure. So it maybe sounds provocative. I don't think hate is meaningless, and I don't think speech that any one of us might consider hate speech doesn't have an impact. We have the First Amendment because speech is dangerous, right? Speech matters, it's effective, it's the thing that drives more of us to act, to believe things, to structure our lives than anything else. So I'm in full agreement that to an extent our system of free speech does create this landscape for people to disseminate ideas with the intention and effect of riling people up against other people. And that's a really challenging landscape. So to the extent of what I now like unfree speech is a better frame than free speech. So what do I mean when I say hate speech is a meaningless concept? Well, so the law, and I'm sure my co-panelists will talk about this as well, the law doesn't recognize, being mean, being cruel, being hateful and false about a group of people in particular, and saying, hey, you people over here, you should dislike all of those people who look like that or are from there. The law doesn't ascribe legal significance to that unless it's sort of a call to action of some kind, right? And so, so the concept of taking a bunch of speech and saying, no, that's not speech, that's hate speech, it obfuscates because it does lead people to believe, and many of them lead students to believe that what they have when there's been this really hostile speech is as a cause of action, as a right to say, okay, we can go stop this person from doing this. In fact, that's not the case. And it tends to muddle, and there's data to support this, it tends to muddle students' responses when they're asked about whether they value free speech. Because many of them do not consider hate speech, what they would call hate speech, to be protected speech. So a lot of these polls that you get about students, do you value inclusion or freedom in this area, they're based on a sense that that the rules of the game are different than they are, and I think that is problematic. So that's among the reasons I say it's useless. It's also because it's a double-edged sword. And what I find is when you give someone the power to shut others up, the dominant group, the empowered group, tends to get better at using that cudgel than marginalized people. So I had a conversation with students in our honors program here last night about some really alarming statements that have been made in classrooms that they have been hearing about the challenges of a system that would empower students to have a lot of recourse about certain student and faculty behavior, because what we know is that evaluations of teaching, for instance, used as a cudgel, tend to bite marginalized, faculty from marginalized identities more, right? And so rather than a glorious triumphalist vision of free speech, free speech is great and all the great ideas will come out. America is proof. The slightly functional, practical one, which is the problem of ascribing authority to limit speech to almost anybody you know, and who's going to end up being, sort of bludgeoned with it. Often the people who are also those bludgeoned with the high costs of free speech.
So I'll turn then next to you, Shannon. Because you've written also about the question of whether we should regulate hate speech, and in an op-ed from a few years ago, you said, that the Constitution did not come to us from Mount Sinai. It was written by men, not gods, and really in quite a different era from that which we're in right now in dealing with these issues. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your ideas about thinking about hate speech and speech that we might regulate. And do you share Laura's concerns about what it would mean if we gave those in power the ability to shut other people up?
I was sitting here trying to remember the context in which I said that quote that you just read. But yes, I have written about it. I don't use the framework of hate speech myself. I think it's a terribly misleading idea. I think you can hate legitimately and for very rational reasons a great number of things. There are political and religious ideologies that deserve hatred because they are at their core anti-equality ideologies. So I prefer to think of this as a question of anti-equality speech. And so for me, that's a very narrow category of speech. It should be, because I do think in democracies we ought to err generally on the side of more speech and not less. I'm concerned with a category of speech which, before the unfortunate euphemism of alternative facts caught on, we would have called lies. I'm talking about speech that is a propaganda campaign. It is designed to dehumanize, to degrade, and to disenfranchise the groups targeted by it. And those groups are almost always historically marginalized identity groups. So, and in a sense, this is speech that cannot say what it says without also doing what it does. It's speech and action simultaneously. And I don't mean to say that it is, since it is action, it is not speech. That would be a grave mistake in the framework. What I'm saying is, it is speech and action simultaneously. Speech acts, right? And there are many areas in U.S. law in which we already recognize this. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, for example, we recognize that speech can create hostile working environments, for example. A federal court had no trouble, for example, recognizing, and brace yourselves for this example, that men chanting cunt in the presence of their only female coworker had engaged in sex discrimination, even though they had effectuated that discrimination using only words. So, but outside of these sort of narrow contexts, we have this sort of uniquely American delusion, I think, that you can split off the speech that creates the context from the violence that is done in the context. And unfortunately, I think what I meant when I said the First Amendment didn't come from Mount Sinai, it wasn't written by God. But what I mean is, we have this idea prevalent in U.S. society and largely propagated by groups like the ACLU and others, that says the First Amendment is a preeminent value and there's essentially no counterweight to it. But there are really no constitutional values that are absolute. The Supreme Court has recognized in almost every other situation that if the state has a compelling interest, that fundamental right for a constitutional value must yield to the state's compelling interest. And it's my view that the 14th Amendment's commitment to equality creates that compelling interest. And so we need to start having a conversation about speech in the First Amendment that proceeds as if the 14th Amendment exists, and rather than sort of proceeding as if the First Amendment exists only. It exists in a vacuum, and that speech somehow stops in our head. and does not actually effectuate material consequences in the real world.
So speech that degrades or dehumanizes and that can't be separated from action, some of the things we were talking about a minute ago, and I'm thinking, you know, again, this question of if we were to draft that legislation, pass that law, change the Constitution, etc., I mean, are the concerns, the sort of traditional concerns about empowering those with power to enforce those ideas, does that cause you any?
Oh, well, of course it does. It does. It's a very legitimate point. But I think any framework is open to abuse. And there are abuses. For example, what comes to mind is Title IX. Of course there are miscarriages of justice with regard to Title IX. There are mistakes being made. There are implementation mistakes being made. But do I think that we live in a safer, dare I say, more equal world because we have Title IX? Absolutely. So I think that there would be growing pains. But I also tend to think that, you know, one of the reasons we have this sort of sticks and stones may break my bones, the words never hurt me attitude in the United States, is that for the most part, the American middle classes have never had to deal with the kind of trauma of, say, a Holocaust. It seems quite legitimate that countries like Germany, for example, would ban the swastika or the Holocaust lie literature or the Nazi Party, because people have seen firsthand, in a very real and personal and in-your-face way, the ways in which anti-identity propaganda campaigns, in fact, not only break hearts, but do break hearts. In the United States, largely we've been insulated from that. People are content to say, even though they know it's happening, these things don't go on here. And they can sit back and say sort of smugly, well, we do freedom better. We know better. Other countries that try to limit certain types of speech are despotisms. When the reality is every other civilized industrial country in the world has some limitations, incitement to hatred laws, for example, in Britain or Canada. So, of course, there will be possible abuses, but I don't think that's a reason for doing nothing in the face of extraordinary evidence that there are extremely high costs for this kind of speech as action for traditionally marginalized people.
Really love to think about it. It's very interesting. Ibram, I'm wondering how, you know, this idea that we live in that there's been this uniquely American delusion, to use your words, Shannon, about these issues, and that, you know, we haven't had here the kind of, you know, history that would bring about these changes. I mean, if we think about the history of genocide in the United States and others, there clearly is some history of you know, things that are like things that happened in the 20th century in other European countries. So how do you think about that? You know, are we under a delusion around these issues?
I think so, and I think that's part of the problem, because we can't have a real conversation, because Americans are delusional about their history, Americans are delusional about their present, Americans are delusional about their own ideology, Americans are delusional about their identity, Americans are delusional about even the way in which they see the world. And so trying to have a conversation about history, ideology, identity, the world, is difficult. And the delusions are, first and foremost, Americans are misled into believing that we've progressed as a nation racially. That you know, we are headed sort of towards, on this march of racial progress. That we are a nation committed to the ideals of freedom and equality. That we are ruled by the rule of law. You know, all of these different types of ideas that for people who look like me and who've experienced a different type of America, you know, we can see sort of how it's a delusion. And so for ideas like free speech, or, I mean, and this idea that Americans are committed to free speech. And, you know, I guess to give a few other examples, there's so many instances in our society where speech is restricted and that's normal, and people have no problem with it. And so, for instance, there are so many different ways in which I can't tell my supervisor certain things and then turn around and say, oh, well, what about the First Amendment? Or kids at their school right now can't just say whatever to their teachers and then sort of hide behind the First Amendment. Or I can't say whatever to a police officer on my way home and then, claim free speech. And so all of that is normal. Oh, it makes sense that, you shouldn't sort of harass or speak out against parents or against teachers or against police officers or against other authority figures. But then when it comes to sort of restricting speech that justifies racist policies, that justifies sexist policies, that justifies inequities of all kinds, somehow people then raise the banner of, well, that's just free speech. And I think one of the greatest illusions, not shut up, is how we understand freedom. And I think one of the things that I've tried to sort of emphasize in my work is that there are two kinds of freedoms that Americans are fighting over. And so some Americans have been fighting for the freedom to oppress, for the freedom to enslave, for the freedom to express whatever negative and degrading thing they want to say whenever they want to, while other Americans have been fighting for freedom from oppression, freedom from slavery, freedom from living in a world in which you're constantly told that you're less than. And so we should recognize that freedom itself is contested, and it always has been.
I was going to go to freedom next, actually, as well. I'm thinking about, narratives here in the U.S. about American exceptionalism, for example, right? So I'm hearing, that we're different from other countries, that we have laws that are different, that we have delusions maybe that are different. But I want to just consider, for Laura, I mean, is there anything that is really, that with regard to Americans' protections and Americans' free speech and Americans' celebration of concepts like freedom and liberty, which are so deeply, deeply ingrained here, is there any value in that? Is there any value in the history of having the First Amendment that's been protected, the history of having speech laws that have been largely, that have largely permitted a great deal of speech to go on?
So to use negotiation speak, yes and. That Americans would generally profess a preference that government not punish expression seems like a positive thing. And then there are wrinkles. One is that Americans, like we do with deficit spending and gun control and a million other things, we say one thing sort of writ large philosophically, and then in the trees we differ. So the huge majority of Americans say they'd rather we didn't, have big deficits. But then you ask them what they would cut, and usually the only thing that gets a majority is aid to poor people in other countries. Nobody wants to cut just about anything else. So, yay. Yes. Gun control doesn't sound very good. I just like background checks and red flag laws, and I don't like our care. And that actually is the case with free speech. So you have a president who just did a free speech executive order, but is very buddy-buddy with, Liberty University that's on the top 10 worst campuses for free speech. You have people who are screaming that the worst thing happening in America right now for free speech is that, students from traditionally marginalized identities who hadn't been included in college before are now at college saying, hey, why don't you avoid treating me terribly? It's like, oh no, and that's terrible, right? But support laws that would penalize people for engaging in boycotts to express dissatisfaction with the U.S.'s policy for Israel. So people tend to, or they don't want, a female congresswoman of color to use a colorful language, because that's very, very bad. So people tend to profess this preference for freedom of speech, but they tend to be very situational about it, and they often mean, well, the government shouldn't control speech, but my preferences matter, right? So I just think that's, it's important to recognize we're not great about this. Is the concept of a commitment to free speech very good? I would say yes, but the First Amendment doesn't purport to be a blueprint about how to live, right? It takes one possible tool out of the government's hands in solving societal problems, the tool of punishing speech. That's all the First Amendment does. It's not a blueprint for how to live. So if you profess free speech values with no interest in values, actually, and protection of other people, we don't need to exercise our liberty to be horrible and bigoted. And I think a challenge with the free speech narrative as characterized by those who want to bring Milo to campus and those who want to complain about so-called political correctness or biased professors or the horror of having to use the correct pronoun when they're referring to another human being. Is that they're not looking at the responsibilities. What am I supposed to be doing with this freedom? And they're looking at the bad stuff, the real garbage speech, the lies, the junk science, the anti-vax people, the Milos, all of this as a benefit and a virtue of free speech, and not as its very high cost that we should actually be using our other societal tools to remedy and reduce.
Not a blueprint for life, but I mean, this idea of, I hate what you're saying, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it, right? Is it then just a delusion, this idea, could we have a situation for any of you, where we have a celebration of free speech that moves back to a place of being completely bipartisan, or nonpartisan, celebrated by all, supported by all, and I agree that on college campuses we're seeing both sides, all sides, of the political spectrum trying to infringe upon each other's rights to speech, perhaps reflecting this idea that we can never attain that ideal of a situation where everyone agrees that everybody else should be able to say whatever they want all the time. But is there a way to get to that ideal, or is this another delusion?
I think the way to get to that ideal is to recognize exactly what's at stake and what we're talking about. And sometimes I think the conversation gets very muddy. At least for me, I'm not interested in veering into territory where I'm not talking about speech that offends people. I'm talking about speech that works a real citizenship injury on people. So I think it would be a rather dangerous and un-American environment if speech that simply offends someone could be suppressed by the government or some government actor. I think we have to be very careful in understanding that the real dangers here are looking at the First Amendment as if it protects an absolute right to dehumanize and to discriminate against a targeted group of people with the intent of essentially silencing them and driving them out of the political process. It's a threat to their citizenship. It isn't merely, I don't like Republicans, you're all assholes, or whatever, right? Justice Scalia famously, suggested that sexist speech should not be treated any differently than speech that showed preference for one political party over another. It's asinine, right? The risks and what is at stake in that paradigm are not the same. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And I think we also have to keep in mind that Professor Kennedy was giving a list of examples in which there are exceptions to the First Amendment. The law is recognized. And of course, the First Amendment is shot full of holes. It's just the exceptions recognized generally work to entrench the power of the already powerful. Contract law, for example, is a huge hole in the First Amendment, right? I can't agree to have a contract with you, and then once you've performed the service of the labor, say, oh, well, I was just exercising my First Amendment right, I have no intention of paying you. But a more apt example in this context is I cannot say kill to my trained attack dog, and after it has mauled a person, defend my actions by asserting my First Amendment rights. That is the sort of speech that I'm concerned about. The speech that essentially posits killers, that creates the environment in which people who are disposed already, for reasons that have been explained, to hate the targeted group, to create violence, to enact violence against that group. So I worry that the discussion on college campuses often devolves to, did that hurt my feelings? But for me, this is not about hurt feelings. This is about genuine citizenship injuries. And I think that we do have to begin having an intelligent conversation about how one tells the difference. Because as long as we're in the quagmire of everything that hurts my feelings should be forbidden, then we really are not making useful progress to defining anti-equality speech and creating solutions that can deal with it or at least ameliorate its effect.
Yeah, I mean, I just would say I agree. Like, I think that, and I'm saying this from the standpoint that I have students of color who come to me and express that something was said that hurt their feelings or offended them, and express that that's something that should be forbidden. And I typically push back. And for me personally, if it would, I think our focus should be on public forums and public officials, and especially public officials. And so I don't think public officials should have the legal ability to express speech that is both false and dangerous. I don't think they should have the legal ability to express sexist and racist and homophobic and ableist and elitist ideas. I don't think that they should have that legal ability. Now, people in their homes, people in a classroom, I mean, I think that's a completely different story. But I think if we were to just restrict public officials from doing that, I mean, I know in my study of racist ideas, history of racist ideas, it was these public people who are the people who essentially mass circulated ideas. And they typically did so for specific personal, economic, political, or even cultural gain. In other words, I'm going to convince millions of Americans to believe that there's widespread voter fraud. And I can't, and the government or no other body can essentially sort of punish and restrict that speech because it's, quote, free. And then that fundamentally allows those very political operatives to justify voter suppression policies and swing elections that sort of shape the course of American history. And even though study after study has shown that voter fraud is as rare as alien abduction, literally, they still have the right and ability to basically continuously traffic in those ideas under the banner of freedom. I mean, that to me is something that should not be. And so to me, that's completely different than someone saying, oh, well, you're ugly. I mean, it's like, this is America itself at stake. And we should just recognize, let me just say, I don't think we have recognized the power that bigotry and bigoted words and bigoted ideas and tropes have had over the course of American history. And the reason is because we think, even though I think many people would agree with this idea that people are not born into bigots, we also don't recognize the systemic ways in which public officials train and nurture people to be bigots. Like I don't think we completely conceptualize that because we just simply classify these people, or they're just hateful, or they're just ignorant, as if it's personal to them, as if there's no other as if they're just learning these ideas outside of a larger political context, as if there's no public people who are training them to think that way. And so I think if we had a greater awareness about how people became mass murderers and made the connections, because they're saying it in their words, or in their posters, or in their manifestos, but we still don't want to make that connection. Sorry.
Mind if I just follow up on this point? I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well, I just want to follow up on this point of context, because I think it's such an important point in this conversation. I think that we have the problem in this country of sort of suppressing in a sort of pious, even-handed conversation about so-called hate speech. The idea that we are in a system that is supposedly not constitutionally neutral in the concept of equality. And that is a question that is always contextual. So I don't think in this particular framework, the general sort of left political spectrum impulse of more inclusion is the answer. I think we have to look at context, and we have to understand that there are some groups in our society that have historically been the victims of invidious discrimination. And we have to realize that we need a rule, we need a framework that allows us to recognize the effects of anti-identity speech against those groups as it acts in the real world. Not in some law school classroom hypothetical, but how is it affecting these groups in the real world? And I'll give you an example. If I were to go to a rural school board meeting in the United States, and I were to say, straight men sexually abuse children, and therefore we should not hire straight men to be elementary school teachers because they are a danger to our children. Now, of course, statistically, I'd be absolutely accurate about that because it is true that straight men do most of the sexually abusing of children, the abuse of children in this country. But the truth is, what I'm saying would be misleading, and it would also contextually have absolutely no effect on the ability of any straight man applying for an open position in that school district to get a job. But because context matters, and cultural context matters, if I were to show up to that same school board meeting and say, gay men sexually abuse children, they are a danger to our children, and therefore we cannot risk hiring a gay person as an elementary school teacher. The likelihood is that there will be real opportunity costs for the gay community in terms of whether or not they are employable in that context. So speech does not have an equal effect simply because it is equal in or similar in kind. And I think we have to start making those hard distinctions rather than simply say, oh, that person said something that's not nice, so we should punish that person. We have to begin to understand the real material context of how anti-identity speech works. And until we're willing to have those kind of hard conversations that actually do admit the fact that we're not all equal in American society, that we all are starting from different points of opportunity, then we aren't really going to make much headway.
So the voter fraud example is a great example of why the sticks and stones model doesn't work. We have this idea, one concept that's put forth always, the metaphor that anybody being taught in class about free speech is there's a marketplace of ideas, and all the ideas will happen if people buy a great idea, right? And the truth is, though, people who research how people think have found over the years that debunking misinformation is incredibly hard, that people once possessed of misinformation hang on to it. I teach in one of my classes in our information literacy component, we read the debunking handbook. We look at the way things like anti-vaccine or voter fraud myths stick with people. So the idea that it's okay that something's said because the good thing will be said and then everybody will be fine is just inaccurate. That is objectively false. I don't know that brings you to what answer that brings you to, but it is false. It's a false framing of that freedom. But since we're talking in the here about speech on campus and it's the education forum and a lot of us what we're thinking about is one's existence as a student on a campus. I'm hesitant to say that you just hurt my feelings. That's the line, and if it's you just hurt my feelings, like that's it. I mean, there's not going to be necessarily a punishment for that person who hurt a student's feelings. But the fact of the matter is, I have a concern that the consistent message that many students experience related to their identity or experience tells them implicitly and sometimes explicitly, this school is not for you. This campus is not for you. And education where it's where some students will understand themselves to be outsiders, I think is going to be essentially less effective education. We've seen that, and we have this framing right now where what I'm told is that students are snowflakes, they care so much about their feelings, and we used to be tough. Well, in my classes, when someone says we, I always say, define we. We never minded all of the sexist talk at college when George Will, was at college with only men, up to 50% of students in America are food insecure. There are an enormous number of homeless or home residents insecure students in this country, and more students are coming to schools where they're the exception, right? So we have the ADA generation, we have students with disabilities more likely to be included, but they arrive on campuses and are basically told that their access and their right to education is in position on some professors, and shamed about it. So as a result, you have students who actually are being called snowflakes, and actually have it tougher in a lot of ways than the students before them. And what we see is there's an enormous amount of stress on them. So I understand the impulse to say, well, when we're talking about a legal system, when we're talking about legal responses to hate, when we're talking about legal responses to things that cause massive systemic damage, drawing a line between, this is anti-equality or, white supremacist language that is designed to make the structure worse and more unfair and hurt feelings is a workable one. But I'd say it's not in terms of students' access to education. We actually have to do far, far better in terms of what we're delivering to students. And I think it's a real mistake to call it sort of childishness and sort of hypersensitivity for students to be voicing those concerns, because you're saying, grow up and be really compliant like a good little child. It's a mixed message. You're saying, don't self-advocate, don't speak up, be compliant. That's what grown-ups do. Well, I hope not.
I think that's a very valid point. I do think we still have to be careful that we don't allow, through the hurt feelings or I'm offended paradigm, the use of legitimate responses to anti-identity speech as a way for the majority to entrench their power. So an example I'm thinking of is the white student research, which I was written to about. A white student recently on a college campus was called by an African-American student a cracker. He wanted that treated as a sort of bias incident in the same way that a month before the university had to respond to an incident in which a white student had called an African-American student the N-word. Those things are not equivalent. They are not equivalent in the citizenship injury that is effectuated. Now, I'm not a preacher, I'm not a moral philosopher, I'm a lawyer. So I'm not interested in getting into that white student's head and finding out if he was really offended or not. What I'm saying is there has to be some useful distinction made between what really offends and what actually robs you of equal citizenship and equal citizen dignity. That's not to say there aren't instances in which the lines don't get easily blurred, and in which that which offends us also effectuates citizenship injury, but they're not always simultaneous.
No, absolutely. What I'm saying is, for a citizen of the university, right, a certain kind of offense, particularly when you're talking about marginalized identities, actually is a citizenship injury because this is your workplace, your home, your living space, your professional network, your social network, your health provider, everything. The college experience is so all-encompassing. And all of us who are not students, we go home to our safe spaces, you know, and if our loved ones who live with us, you know, hate our thoughts and our identity, that's to be brought up with our own health providers, but, you know, but we have that and they don't. But I am, and I think this is the difference between as a regulator and an educator, you know. As an educator, I do want to be in the head of that student who thinks, you know, calling me cracker is the same as utilizing a racial slur that, you know, has oppression and violence associated with it, or disliking Trump voters is the same as disliking transgender people. I want to be in their head because their head is, you know, my job and all of ours. And there's a journey for us to be taking together. And that's why I'm agreeing in great measure with these formulations of the shortcomings of our free speech model. But I'm saying, you know, this is a question on campus that a lot of people, I think, grapple with when they're talking about creating communities, learning communities, and running them, and running classrooms, or just being students. Is this question of, you know, it actually matters where the ideas come from and whether this person understands that as a whole game. This is actually a time when you could potentially have that student develop habits of mind where he understands the difference between cracker and name slur, and goes forth and is a better, you know, anti-racist, pro-equality citizen himself.
And I could say briefly, I think there's two different conversations sort of going on. I think on the one hand, the student perspective is such that I think what I encourage students to distinguish between that just because a form of speech is offensive doesn't necessarily mean you have to personally offend. And I say that to say, because if you say, for instance, you're a black person living in this society, chances are you're going to hear speech that is offensive pretty regularly. But if you personally feel offended every single time you hear that speech, your life is essentially going to be an emotional roller coaster. So is it possible for people to get to a point in which they recognize speech as offensive and they think there's something necessarily wrong with the person who said it, as opposed to feeling offended, and even in some ways being shocked that that speech is still sort of circulating. And I think that happens, like people can distinguish between, people don't necessarily feel offended when speech is offensive because they recognize the type of society that they're living in, how rampant that speech is, how much they know that speech is false, and how much they know that speech has really nothing to do with them and everything to do with that person. On the other hand, I think when it comes to sort of building a campus community, even though on the one hand I would encourage students to distinguish between speech that is offensive but then not necessarily feel offended, when it comes to sort of creating a campus climate, an environment, you know, I've long advocated zero tolerance sort of policies for bigoted type of speech. And it would seem like a contradiction, you know, but in fact, you can simultaneously teach individual students to not be affected by this speech, and as a campus body, do everything in your power to ensure that this speech isn't sort of circulated. And to me, if both of those things were happening, the likelihood of that student, citizen, essentially that type of speech occurring and then simultaneously wrecking their day and then simultaneously wrecking their academic performance goes down precipitously. However, typically when you talk about zero tolerance sort of policies, the reaction is typically, the critique of it, and that's the non-legal critique, of course, about free speech, but the other sort of critique of it demonstrates that people are more concerned about the livelihood of the perpetrator than the victim. So they say, well, if we have zero tolerance, then what's going to happen to that person who, of course, says that thing? Oh, maybe that's too harsh of a reaction, and instead we should just educate them. We are an educational space, and all of that sort of demonstrates that we care more about the perpetrator of an act as opposed to the victim. And I think whatever we sort of create to make the campus more hospitable to people of color and to other groups that are constantly sort of being attacked with offensive speech, we have to simultaneously figure out ways or procedures that puts the victims at the center, and figure out ways to arm the victims themselves. And I think we typically focus on one or the other as opposed to both.
I just want to ask you all to think more, if you have any deeper thoughts here about some of the ambiguities. I'm going to bring out some of the things that we've been saying. I mean, this idea that the C word, okay, is nowhere near, right, it pales in comparison, it's not really in the same ballgame as the N word, right? That students, that one should, that legally there could be a way to distinguish between when one group is called one, when one group is called another, right? And I'm being playful with it on purpose here because I want to think about what happens when we start to say that there are certain words or categories of statements and that people are going to decide that the context in which they were said mean one thing or another. There are also situations in which today, right, when one person's saying to another the N-word can be a term of endearment, of friendship, if we're just thinking of two abstract individuals saying things to one another, and that if we were to empower people to start policing speech in that way, there could be those who would find themselves attacked through it, right, for using speech that they don't mean as a slur in any way. The other groups here that I think about as we talk about, campus community and different groups on campus, right, one of the groups that, is allied to President Trump with the EO is Students for Life and their leader, Kristen Hawkins. And they maintain a database of every time the Students for Life who set up, sometimes it's an anti-abortion group, and they'll set up little graveyards. They look like little graveyards for the unborn. And so those students, many of whom would say that they are, I don't know if we should call them a minority, but they would certainly be outnumbered on numerous campuses. They might say that they experience invidious discrimination in their classes, right? They may come from a population, from a background that reflects the demographic mold of the majority and the historical dominance in the country, right? So should those students have to bear, I guess, in some ways, the historic weight of the country on the things that they say in their experiences on campuses? So to me, I think a lot of these things are a little more, I think they're just a little bit harder in a lot of circumstances to divine between. And then the last one would be, anodyne statements, or statements that were once anodyne, which now have taken on a greater significance. In some ways, saying the N-word to someone, totally, right, heinous, a white person, black person. But what about the situation in which someone is being shouted, make America great again? Someone in a really horrendous way, to a group of, let's say, Latino students that said to them, that the word itself, right, there's nothing in that phrase that would necessarily have that, like, certain, paper black and white, that obvious weight of history, and yet it is weighted with history. It is weighted with contemporary politics and meaning. So some of these situations, to me, seem more ambiguous. It might be more difficult for us to both sort through legally and for campus administrators. So any thoughts on that?
So I think the extent to which some people have weaponized what they're framing as religious liberty as a way to knock, holes you could drive a semi through, holes in civil rights statutes, should make people nervous, right? When I was working for many years to pass what became the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, we got a lot of free speech objections to it. And, as you said, we look all the time at what people have said in advance of committing a crime. It wasn't a free speech problem. But one of the things that came up again and again was, you're going to jail ministers for preaching the gospel. And there's a very successful pushback against this law that does very little. It's used, even in the last administration, it's used very little, this federal hate crimes law, as this attack on Christians. And what happened subsequently, people are familiar with, from Indiana to North Carolina to Chick-fil-A, wherever, is framing calls for equality, particularly by LGBTQ people, as religious oppression. And it's been very successful, and you can expect, the two most recent selections to the Supreme Court were picked in part because of their hospitality to utilizing religious liberty as an anti-equality tool. And I would expect that a campus in which students with a view they framed as religious, that was deeply anti-equality, if you will, made claims about their rights and protections and the speech that was directed at them as anti-equality speech toward Christians, particularly. I think they do pretty well. And I think we're seeing as well in weaponizing, critiques of the Israeli government, weaponizing claims of discrimination there as well, regardless of where you are on any of these policies. I think the challenge is legally, realistically, you're going to have fairly strong sort of anti-equality type movements and sentiments possibly become more powerful.
So, I think to your question, I actually think it's fairly simple. I actually don't think it's as, it doesn't have to be as complicated. And I think in the example of the C word, I think what we forget about that term is that term has been used to target and denigrate poor white people historically. Like terms like white trash, like terms like rednecks. And there's a series of sort of terms that even people of color weaponize against white people. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that term is equivalent to the N-word, partly because when you sort of compare the experiences of the white poor with the experiences of the black poor, they're just not equivalent. But on the other hand, I would, any sort of term like that, that has a long and a loaded history, I think that it is something that we shouldn't be using. And I do think that even people of color have said terms, especially about other people of color, that are loaded. Now, terms like the N-word and people using that as a term of endearment, again, in the dictionary, you have terms that have multiple definitions, right? And so, why can't the N-word have multiple definitions, a positive one and a negative? There were other words like that in the dictionary. And so if we were to, of course, allow for the positive and then and not allow for the negative, we would have to, of course, in the statute, be very, very clear and crystal clear about what's allowable and what is not. And But I would say, in terms of groups like anti-abortion activists, again, you have the ability and the right to express your speech so long as what you're saying is not false. And I think that oftentimes, too often, these groups say things that have been proven to be false. Or in the midst of their campaign, they are specifically targeting a particular group, like Democrats are killing people, right? And so that's gonna then cause a person to think, oh, let me protect babies from Democrats by going to kill Democrats, right? And so you can talk about the issue itself without necessarily targeting a particular group of people as dangerous, or talk about the issue itself without using statistics that are blatantly false.
There was a lot in your question and a lot in follow-up. So I just want to touch on a few points. The first is, I'm not advocating the Marquis of Queensberry's rules for speech. Unquestionably, there are uncivil, I tend to take Maya Angelou's view of this actually, which is a vulgarity, whether it comes out of a black mouth or a white mouth. I would not, and I feel the same way about the gay community. I do not care when my gay brothers address one another as fag. I don't consider that a term of endearment. I consider that a word that was created to dehumanize me, and one that affects that dehumanization regardless of who says it and when. But when we're talking about a legal standard to deal with anti-identity speech, yes, we have to have a standard. That standard has to be equality. Yes, we have to have a fact finder, and that fact finder has to take into account both context and intent. There are a few things that I agree with about the Brandenburg standard, Brandenburg versus Ohio, the Supreme Court's last word on incitement. But the necessity of an intent component is one of the things that I do agree with from that case. So I think we can have separate conversations about what we can deal with from an institutional, legal standpoint, and then what is merely a lesson in civility that we should be, as educators, giving all students who pass before us. But we cannot have a system that legally treats the two as the same. It will collapse into itself. So I think we have to be very careful. We have to have a very sharp definition, and we have to empower fact finders with easy to follow standards. And I think we have to do a better job educating people generally. And what I thought of was James Baldwin's definition of racism. When he was asked if a black person could be a racist, and Baldwin's response was no. Now, you have to be very careful about what he's actually saying here. He's not saying that a black person cannot be a bigot and cannot be prejudiced. But Baldwin says racism, the thing that makes it an ism, is that you have the institutionalized power to make people pay for it. So that context is essential to animating any rule and any framework that can deal carefully and progressively with anti-identity speech campaigns. And I think that, unless we keep that in mind, and unless we keep that as the educational standard that we keep going back to, then we're just sort of going to continue to go in circles with this conversation, and we're never going to make any real progress.
I want to go back to something we began with, talking about like delusions in the United States, delusions of freedom, delusions of free speech, etc. And you've all taught college students, you all do teach college students. And I'm thinking about this point, Ibram, you made about words in the dictionary having positive and negative connotations, or that we could indeed develop ways of distinguishing between who's using words when. Are we in danger of being too naive or being delusional that young people can understand these things? And I think about, for example, an experience at a university in Minnesota where a professor was teaching, of all things, James Baldwin, a text that uses the N-word many times, and he asked the students, is there a distinction between if I say, he said the N-word, or we call it the N-word? Okay? And he was trying to ask them, he was trying to provoke that conversation about, for students, young people, in a pedagogical setting, the word of this spread on the campus, The next class, there were a bunch of protesters who attended, upset that he, as a white professor, had used this word. He has now, he's ultimately been suspended from teaching, and this is someone who, teaching for many years, has never come up before, when he's taught Baldwin or anything else, and maybe it was just a slip up, maybe he just said it by accident. I actually believe in the context, a student asked a question using the N-word first, and then he used it in his response. I believe that's the detail. But just, are we being delusional about, such situations that we can teach young people to understand these differences, and that we aren't opening more and greater cans of worms with some of this?
So, the K-12 education system is this very authoritarian model. And students overwhelmingly, and in particular, the lowest resource schools are the most authoritarian ones, actually. And students are, they're asked to do a lot. They're hamsters on the treadmill a lot. And their parents are also, in some cases, particularly students who have, great high resources, are very engaged in advocating for them and saying what can and can't be done. And college is very different. It's an adult learning environment, it's supposed to be. But nobody teaches that, really. So students, and most of the expectations that we have, like your expectations about what you can say to your boss, they're kind of implicit in ways you pick them up. And what happens is we flip a switch where you go from the boring rote AP US history class to one of our classes. And all of these different expectations, but they're not ready, including they often don't know very much about the people around them. I had 3 students in the same class say to me privately in office hours, this is the most diverse community I've ever been in, this is the least diverse community I've ever been in, and I didn't know till I came here what white people thought of us. They were all in the same class. So the deal is, yes, we can teach students things, but we have to be committed, really, and principled about what it is we want to teach them. And if our mission is, don't be oppressive, understand the difference between people saying names and racism, which is an ism, we have to do it. A colleague of mine and I, Andrew Brown, who's actually here, wrote a book called How to College, What to Know Before You Go and When You're There, that's coming out in a few weeks. And we did it in part, we did it a lot, it's about preparing to get ready, and a lot of the book engages with this question of learning about the community you're going to be in, learning about what the college expectations are, finding out the perspectives, what are their incomes, what are their backgrounds, what are their demographics, where are they from in the country, in order to be a kind of good citizen, and be understood, and understand those around you so you can engage with them. And we're hoping students really do that because, yes, we have orientation, yes, professors try sometimes to be kind or not, or model good adult behavior sometimes. But you can teach people things, but that involves a commitment to being very explicit about what it is you're asking of people. And I would say the number one thing, from my perspective on that, is be explicit with them that when you talk about not engaging in oppressive behavior, not engaging in oppressive speech, that you're not asking a person to limit her freedom. You're asking her to sort of maximize her actualization, do better at this job of being a community member and a student, and then really model that. And that's why I don't know that I'm interested in the kind of consequences or punishment model quite as much as my colleagues. But it's not good enough for professors to live by the, well, if I hurt their feelings, that's no problem model. Because we're supposed to be showing them how this is done.
So I want to respond directly to this particular example, and I'm going to take a very concrete position here, which is going to be unpopular with some people. Anybody who knows my work will know that's not exactly rare. I think this is sheer idiocy. And In the last year, I actually had, and the other interesting thing about students, at least in my experience, is that they rather convey, they rarely convey a concern directly to me. At some point in the infantilization of adults that's taken place in the last 25 years, we've taught people that rather to engage with the person with which you have a disagreement, that you go to whatever superior you believe there is and you complain. So the complaint was, I teach constitutional law. Brown versus Board, of course, is a bedrock protection case, and the opinion written by the Chief Justice Warren uses the word, which was the word not even thought by African Americans as problematic at the time, Negro, to refer to black people in the community. So the complaint registered with the dean was that rather than assign this case from the casebook, that I should retype it and insert the word black in place of Negro. This is an absurdity, right? We cannot allow the absurd to derail us from a serious conversation about the material citizenship consequences of real anti-identity propaganda campaigns in the real world. And I think, even though my general sense is that university administrators are ever-invented cowards, I mean, the idea that this person is suspended from his teaching position for teaching James Baldwin is an absurdity. And I think that it is our job as professors and administrators to say to young people, to say to 19-year-olds, I hear what you're saying, but you are wrong about this. And when you are older, you will understand why you are wrong about this. But I am not going to empower you to use your ignorance of a particular context to shut down the education system. And I think until we get the guts to do that, rather than to worry about the drive-by Twitter campaign that will necessarily be effectuated by this sort of honesty, until we get the guts to respond to reality as opposed to public relations problems, we really are living in a situation where real marginalization gets swept up and covered over by these sorts of individual, here's my protest moment, I've got to seize it. I think we have an obligation as people from marginalized communities who have been, or at least tried to do our best, tried to do our part in bettering the situation, to say to people, this is not that moment. And you might want to think about using your resources and your time and your obvious intelligence to go out and find a situation in which you can really make a positive difference. But this is not it.
Right. If you want to add anything?
Sure. I think this is it's a difficult situation. I think because on the one hand, I think African Americans have made it, I think, crystal clear that it's not socially acceptable for a white person to say the N-word in no context, even if it's repeating literature. And I think that because of that, particularly within the black community, whenever a white person says the N-word, there's typically a response. And I can completely understand why there's that sort of response. I guess I would sort of also agree with what was just said, in that I wish there was that type of response from students when they look around at their campus and saw that black students were underrepresented, or black faculty were underrepresented, or that the administrative body wasn't diverse. And so I don't necessarily have a problem with students reasserting the sort of widespread idea that it's socially unacceptable for white people to say the N-word. I have a greater problem if those students are not also involved in activism to diversify their campus, if they're not also involved in activism to drive out racist policies on their campus, in their community, and you have students who are doing both, and you have students and people more broadly who just see racism or hear racism when someone says the N-word.
So, in my classes, I teach in school of public affairs, so the things that I do are, it's all really provocative stuff, name my Commonwealth class, God, guns, and gays. And I tell the students the first day of class, you're going to read a bunch of Supreme Court opinions. First of all, some of them are just going to say things that are going to be problematic. We're going to read a case where the Supreme Court says, yeah, sure, you can put Japanese Americans in internment camps. And we probably shouldn't call them concentration camps, though, because that's like mean. We'll call them, gardens. And so you're not going to enjoy that, and the language is going to be pretty harsh too. We read a case about intellectual disability discrimination, and the R word was the operative term in the piece. So we talk about that, but we also in one of my classes do a conversation explicitly on how you raise these concerns, and we use one of my just favorite teachable moment texts that there is. It's some students wrote, probably have seen this, some students wrote a letter to complain, an open letter, anonymously, to complain about their criminal procedure professor wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt to class. And it's this screed, and it's a mess and stuff. And they did it anonymously as an open letter, shot across the bow. They didn't go to their office hours or something. And so she responded and said, I regret that we can't just have a conversation, but one of your complaints is I'm not teaching you, I'm just giving you politics, so I'm going to teach you. And she goes like, a 6-point response to the substance regarding their complaints about Black Lives Matter and legal education, how it works, and then she says, and every professor, like at the end of a tough week, should read this and just like grin, It says, I used to teach legal writing too, so I'm going to do you the favor of critiquing the writing of this thing as well. So it's fantastic. You're like, gosh, you got them. But I don't teach it as a lesson about Black Lives Matter. I'm explicit with my students, like I have a position on that. I agree Black Lives Matter, I think it's a good and important movement, but that we're going to talk about this interaction and these people's responsibilities to each other in this learning community. We use it as a chance, too, to talk about whether that's maybe different for undergrads and law students, what everybody's responsibilities are. And the hope is that we can have a really good conversation about what productive, important, high-impact activism and self-advocacy for students looks like. But just like people aren't born bigots, but our society does a marvelous, efficient, and universal job of creating it. People aren't born adults, and our society actually doesn't do a particularly great job of making clear what that is. But it becomes a great opportunity to be explicit about what it means and what it means to actually engage for justice in a way that professionals do and adults do. And I find it's an enormously interesting conversation with the students too, because you actually really find out where they are and what their perspectives are. I just don't believe that students who have to pay more for education than anybody has, with the kind of limitations on, and housing and with the kind of limitations on opportunity, that they have, are wasting their own time by making up injustice. I think there's a real anger that comes from serious systemic challenges. And if they're hitting on the wrong thing, I think some degree of, I think digging deeper and saying what is going on here is going to be a service to them and us. And we'll have a better community of adults working together.
For me, as a historian and a student of history, that's where, this experience related for me hits, that I've always felt like the most important thing to do was to be honest and transparent and show students, the history of the world in its, just gruesome detail and honest detail. And to me, it's a betrayal of that, and the idea that it would be better to sanitize the past rather than have people, be able to reckon with it. I want to take that opportunity then to open it up to questions from the floor. I know there's, does someone have a microphone?
Is yours working? I can grab this one back here too. Or not. Yeah, there we go. It's really in place. Okay.
There we go, it's in the back.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Juanita Johnson, and I'm a master's student at the School of Education. I really liked a lot of you guys' points that were touching on just your different kind of definitions on hate speech, on free speech, and anti-identity speech, and especially their intersection with impacting and with marginalized communities and communities of color. But one thing that you particularly touched on was citizenship injury, and I want to just push back a little because I think the one thing that we kind of do overlook within citizenship injury is what they can cause. So we look at citizenship injury and maybe a hate speech impacting their mental health, and while that may not be immediate, it can potentially lead to suicide, further mental health issues, or just inadequacy of access to education or just spaces on college campuses. And so just taking also your point into mind about the Constitution not really being written by God, so yes, it does have flaws in there. I really want to get all of you guys' opinion on the implication and the kind of ethical nature that making policy and that public officials have in making policy when they may not be necessarily impacted by something that causes like hurt feelings, which can lead to this kind of other sort of citizenship injury. And maybe what does a campus policy or administrator have in making rules and policies when they're not also looking like the communities who are being influenced?
I think it's a very good point. And first of all, thank you for being here to be part of the conversation. I don't think that you and I really have a disagreement. I think you're absolutely right that the injuries that are worked by anti-identity speech can take many forms. And so when you speak about suicide specifically, of course, this hits home to me as a gay man because of the statistics that have to do with the suicide gay youth. And I think that, again, I'm concerned with propaganda campaigns that create an environment in which young people feel that the only way out of this system of nearly hermetically sealed harassment is to take their own life. So again, I think context matters, and the injury largely has to be addressed in its context. So I think you're absolutely right that can be a citizenship injury, right? I mean, you have to see a sort of ultimate citizenship injury, which is you aren't anymore, right? And I do think that we often overlook, again, in our, since I coined the phrase, apparently, our unique American delusion that you can split off speech from the action it produces. I think we overlook the ways in which conceptual liquidation, through language, through propaganda campaigns, almost inevitably culminates in physical liquidation. Whether that's through violent acts by a third party, or whether that's through driving people literally to take action against their own well-being. But I mean, I think these things are serious consequences of anti-identity propaganda campaigns, and they would have to be taken into account.
Thanks, Terry Gibbons, on the panel. But one of the things that struck me as we were having this discussion is the issue of norms. And we've seen the erosion of norms, but also one of the things I focus on is the fact that on college campuses, we've seen this demographic change that needs to lead to a difference in the way we address norms. And so, I mean, there's a kind of a combination of the erosion of norms that we've seen all the way into the presidency, but also a new set of norms that have come into play because of the changes in demographics and the way that new groups are coming into play on college campuses. For example, I've begun to pay much more attention to issues of disability Because we as professors have a tendency to think, oh God, the students coming in to pester us about accommodations. And yet, once you really look into it, those accommodations are critical to their success, and you need to come to a new understanding of those kinds of things.
So, the thing about norms is we miss the ones we miss, and we kick some of the other ones we don't miss out the door, right? So the norm of women behaving themselves enough to not anger men and, not wearing leggings because, then nobody can do math in our presence, right? If we're in leggings, that's just science. We like kissing some norms goodbye. So I think the challenge of the erosion of norms issue is complex. I think this goes to your question too. As educators, we have the good fortune of our learning objectives. And I find enormously freeing to look to the learning objectives and abandon any norms. And this is what happens when you spend a bunch of time writing a book with a sociologist. You question everything. Like, oh wow, is that just a custom that doesn't mean anything? Well, it is. Right? If the things that we choose as modes of assessment, modes of engagement in classrooms, like you could almost have picked some of them out of a hat. An exam? Why? Right? And so I think this gets both to the civility question and actually, most importantly, to the disability question as well, is looking from a perspective of universality. Can I design a space here that's optimal as it relates to the things that we all want to accomplish together? And suddenly you lose a bunch of the stuff that becomes very challenging for disability by identity. So my archetypal example of that is challenging material that could have a real impact on trauma survivors, right? And I'll hear people say, these snowflakes want to opt out. They don't want to engage with the material. And, well, what's your material? Well, it's a video on sexual assault in prison, and this is a criminal justice class. It's very important they know this material. Okay, great. So what you want them to know is about this topic. Yes. Okay. Is there some part of this class that's supposed to be like Paris Island for JLC majors where you become very tough? I was like, that part of it? No. Okay, well, why do they have to watch it in a classroom with 30 other people who are near strangers, no one who they typically comforts them, and the danger of, crying in front of others, where if they watched it in their room, wouldn't matter if they cried, wouldn't matter if they paused it, waited, composed themselves. Or were you judging? Like, are you actually assessing them for their capacity to perform toughness and engaging with this material? No? Cool, let it go. And the good news is you can now have a great conversation about it in class because they're watching it, in the library, at home, or wherever. And so I find that, a lot of the norms that we had in college, they were developed for segregated and exclusionary and elitist spaces anyway. Taking a fresh look at them and saying, okay, well, how would I do this if all I wanted was for them to learn, as opposed to if all I wanted was to do school the way school is done? Answers so many of these questions, I think.
Yeah, my name is Ahmed Baba. Thank you all for being here. We talked a lot about today, what you all did about various systems that perpetuate racist ideas, and since we are in university, that might as well touch on education. I have an example from, I went to public school in Virginia, and one of my teachers invoked the cursive hand to justify, he literally tried to invoke that, plus Aristotle's climate theory, which you touch on both of those in your book, Dr. Kennedy, of literal black inferiority. And my question is, on a broader level, what do you think can be done in the education system to better reform? Because I know it's left to the states, but what do you think we can do structurally to ensure that there's a broader curriculum for a revamp, essentially, that can ensure that racist ideas aren't being perpetuated and we're actually not whitewashing American history in our classrooms?
So I think I would say first, right now, as an example, politicians are writing history standards across the country, not historians in different states. So generally speaking, in many different places, it's political figures who are essentially determining the curriculum itself. And clearly, they have a very specific political self-interest in ensuring the curriculum is going to nurture their own political ideology. And so, I mean, clearly, I think that educators and scholars should be the ones who are writing the curriculum and who are determining the text. And those texts should be based on scholarship and reality as opposed to replicating political ideologies. But I also think, so that's the curriculum itself, but then of course in terms of training of teachers, you know, that's another area in which we essentially need to be able to train teachers to be anti-racist, train teachers to not sort of teach their students how to be homophobic or how to be sexist. And what's ironic is in other fields, we're a testing society, and in many different sort of professions, you have to test to show that you are not going to do harm, right? In that particular sort of area. But when it comes to teachers, they essentially, and I wouldn't advocate necessarily a test, but you know, they have the capacity to essentially consistently do harm, and that's the norm, right? And you know, a teacher has the capacity to literally justify slavery by uttering the curse of Ham, and that's the norm. Clearly, he's probably, or she's probably said it before. And so clearly, you know, teachers need to be trained differently, and we need to ensure that teachers who are certified are truly certified in teaching children the types of children that they're going to sort of serve. And I mean, because, and then finally, you know, we have to just simply take politics, and I don't want to say politics, I should say we should take political self-interest out of education, and we need to take profit out of education. And so there's so many different things we need to take out of education that I think would allow for us to be able to truly educate people, young people, to sort of see the world for what it is, as opposed to seeing the world for what it's not.
I just want to jump in as well, thinking about the importance of the diversification of the teaching staff, not only in K-12 schools, but also in higher education. And just, you know, getting to a new norm around inclusion as just like a really fundamental and powerful and important norm that people understand, that where their engagements with diversity are not once in a while, or that, you know, we did that topic once. And I think it's really important in that effort that we reckon with history as it was written, and for example, I'm thinking of the recent spate of blackface incidents across college campuses that have been happening. R.L. Barnes, who's a professor of history at Princeton, one of the experts on the history of blackface, you know, she wrote an op-ed describing how we stopped teaching anybody what this actually was. You know, that she actually said it's kind of ironic that the push in the civil rights era, largely by black leaders, to get rid of all the minstrelsy and all the ways in which the history of blackface was, you know, in so many places, was largely so successful that it was purged from school curriculum, so that young people today don't necessarily have any idea, she says, of what they're engaging in when they engage in this. They don't necessarily they have never seen such a show, they don't know the history of it, and her arguments around that, I think, are very, very interesting. And so when you have a lot of people who've never had to deal with diversity or inclusion, and, you know, teachers who haven't been trained that way and don't think about it as part of their work, it can be, it's a real challenge, and I think it's about changing norms.
And if I could just add two other quick things. First, so my wife is a physician, and I think for Americans, if we would have, I think many Americans would push back against the idea that someone could essentially train in college for 5 years and then become a physician. We would say, no, they need more training, right? Because they literally have life and death in their hands. And so it makes sense for many people that a physician would have to essentially go to undergrad, then go to medical school, then do a residency, and in some specialties do a fellowship, and train for essentially 12 years, 13 years, before they essentially can be an independent sort of doctor. But then when it comes to teachers, we think it's normal for teachers to only train for 5 years and then essentially have the life or death of our child's minds in their hands.
I don't know if the teacher's trained for 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the same thing with police officers, right? And so, I mean, these are people, you know, and the other thing is, I think that, and I think this is not a radical sort of idea, you know, we talk about wanting to recruit more people into the teaching profession. One of the ways we can do that, obviously, is to increase the pay dramatically, right? And comparing to the doctor analogy, you know, doctors, some would say, are still underpaid. Teachers are, I mean, if doctors are responsible for our bodies, teachers are responsible for our minds. So they should both be paid tremendously. If we're going to have differences in pay, they should both be paid tremendously and relatively equally.
I'm just gonna ask Ida if you can closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts. Well, I suppose my closing thought is a cautionary note. And that is, I guess this observation is probably prompted by a letter that I received from a librarian recently, who read an op-ed that I published in a newspaper about anti-academic speech. And so she wrote to me to say that she had organized a panel discussion in her library about genital mutilation of girls, female genital mutilation, and that she was receiving some extraordinary pressure from some of her higher-ups to cancel this because there had been some public backlash that the discussion would be anti-Islam. And this observation is built into some concerns about will any sort of restrictions on speech become weaponized as a way to shut down all conversations about inequality? Because necessarily to get at inequality, you have to challenge ideologies, political ideologies, and religious ideologies. And where is religion not political, I'd ask you, that in fact perpetrate inequality themselves. And it would be an absurd mistake to say that we cannot interrogate inequality because the people engaging in it, for whatever reason, political, religious or otherwise, see that as an attack on them. We have to have the freedom to have honest conversations about ideologies that in fact do promote inequality. And we cannot allow, as has been the norm in the United States in particular, I mean, you can look at the way that the Christian right has propagandized itself into a victim. The norm has been, if you put a religious label on it, it's hands off. You can't talk about it. That's extremely dangerous. At the same time, I think we have to be extremely careful in saying you have to articulate your complaints and your concerns and your criticisms honestly and carefully. And you know, the example of Representative Omar, I think, is a good one, which is there are absolutely necessary, useful, justifiable complaints against the government of Israel. But as a responsible citizen, and perhaps especially as a politician, you have an obligation to articulate those concerns in ways that aren't essentially falling back on anti-Semitic tropes in 250 characters or whatever it is on Twitter. I don't use Twitter. I think it's better for my mental health. But I mean, I think that we have this sort of drive-by learning environment in the United States where people say, well, they're not going to pay attention to a really serious critique of what's going on here, so I'm going to fall back on some tropes. That's not positive. that's not responsible politics and it's not responsible citizenship. So when we think about what sort of criteria we can produce that might rein in anti-identity propaganda regimes, we have to think very seriously about the requirements that we are willing to impose on ourselves and on our fellow citizens. And we have to come up with something, I think, that pushes people to be more thoughtful, to be more careful, and to be more aware of what an inequality question is really a question of.
Possibly the easiest standard to use is truth as a start. Voter fraud example is an excellent one. Of truth, untruth deployed to oppress is problematic. It's a great thing about universities is that since they exist to engage in sort of knowledge production and dissemination and engagement. It's easy to say, nothing that's untrue really rates being here, and asking people to actually justify their speech in this space. How do you characterize what you're contributing into this space as something that belongs in college? And, the thing is that untruth is never going to make the cut unless it's, satire. Untruth is never going to make the cut, and unproductive speech is never going to make the cut, Well, and it's hard to find truly bigoted behavior that is productive toward the academic enterprise. Have a contest, someone finds some form of bigotry that furthers the academic enterprise. You can't. And so I think we look there. We look to the standards that govern campuses anyway, which is truth and the pursuit thereof.
All right, with that, I'm going to thank our panelists. Please join me in a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Let me just note there's a reception now that takes place in the cafeteria, which is just on the other side of the bank of elevators. So if you walk that way, you'll find the signage there. There's plenty of food and drink there, and then we'll be here by 5 o'clock to start with our second panel.
Smallest.
in sociology and has been directing the Global Education Forum now for, this is our 11th event, and the final one that I'll organize before it hands over to new leadership, so I'm particularly delighted to welcome you all. I know we have a large audience watching live stream, and we encourage you to stay tuned for the whole discussion. Our URL has our participants, our panelists' full bios, so I'm just going to introduce them briefly, and then we'll try to make this as dialogue-based as possible to extend our earlier panel's discussion around issues of free speech and hate speech into kind of some of the global context, and then we probably will go back and forth between the domestic U.S. and the global context on issues of free speech, hate speech, but also the radical right more broadly. So I'll introduce just from left to right, from where I'm sitting and where you can see Professor Matthew Feldman, who, among other hats, is the co-director, director, founder of the Center for Analysis on the Radical Right, one of our co-sponsors, and is the largest organization now dedicated to scholarly analysis of the radical right and is connecting that knowledge to the media and to the general public. Terry Gibbons, who has worn many hats, is an expert on the radical right and on far-right and populist parties in Europe herself, with a long research history, but then also wore several administrative hats, senior administrative hats, most recently provost at Menlo College, and then is now started a new Center for Higher Education Leadership that we're going to hear more about, and I'm sure we'll have lots to say on these issues related to the radical right and higher education. And then Will Alcorn, who's also in the leadership of the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right in the UK, but also heading up a project on counter-narratives and a lot of research trying to think about interventions. And so some of the questions I will push you on are those questions as well. So I'm going to open it up with a really, really broad question and just let you take it. I mean, you've known the topic for a while, and these are topics that you all work on, and I wonder if you each could just say, if you had to choose one thing that you think is the most pressing or the most important or critical issue for our audience to be thinking about related to the radical right and higher education, what would it be?
Actually, it's a deceptively simple question because there's a lot of issues when it comes to the radical right and their resurgence in recent years. I might actually touch on one that, in a sense, bears upon some of your own expertise, which is the mainstreaming of the radical right. We've seen that on campuses and elsewhere. Maybe just take a small aspect of that I'm particularly interested in, which is the sort of removal of the cordon sanitaire, which used to really be a firewall between extremists beyond the pale, on both right and left, but in this context, the radical right that really didn't see itself getting into the media, for example, didn't have space politically, and was really kind of frozen out of mainstream discussions. And I think over the last couple of decades, certainly that we've seen an erosion of that distinction to where several governments in Europe, for example, in Italy and in Austria, perhaps, but also closer to home here in the United States, have seen an erosion between what has traditionally been bigoted, racist, radical right themes and ideas, and a mainstreaming of those ideas into the sort of more conservative or more familiar right, which is really rebranding itself not as the far right, which again, although it's changed dramatically over recent years, is still, I think, quite visible and quite discernible in its forms, but is really kind of taking on some of the forms of what we might call a near right, something that is much more mainstream, really has much more purchase over information and the way in which it circulates, both in America, Europe, and abroad.
Great, thank you. Terry, same question to you.
Yeah, I agree with what we just said, but I think one of my main concerns, and this is actually a concern I've had going back to 2011, I was showing Matt and Will that in 2011 at the University of Texas at Austin, I had a conference about the transatlantic nature of the rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Islam sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment, and so even back then I was seeing the links between people like Pam Geller and Geert Wilders and so on, and that's only grown. And actually what we're seeing too is part of that globalization of the far-right message in particular is being fueled and funded even by the Russians. You know, even I've been following the different elections and how, you know, Mafia Le Pen and Builders and others have been accepting money from the Russians. And so it's part of this underlying theme of trying to disrupt democracy. And so I was giving a talk for a KLRU public television show, and I was saying, one of the things that really disturbs me about all of this is that there's a clear undermining of our democratic principles going on, and not just, in terms of equality, but even just a shift towards authoritarianism that's going on. And so this is very much, you can see it happening in the Philippines and Brazil, in Eastern Europe, and so to me, that's the most pressing issue.
Thank you very much. And Will, same question to you.
Well, yeah, I'd reiterate those 2 points in terms of mainstreaming and transnationalisation. I mean, one of the concerning trends that I've seen in my research in the UK looking at anti-Islam groups is a more direct action and a form of vigilante activism. And this has been seen globally. So we've had groups in the UK like Generation Identity, another anti-Islam group called Britain First, going to mosques and creating sort of publicity stunts. So that's kind of been a more organised form of kind of hate crime that we've seen. We see other groups in Scandinavia, in Norway. There's a group called the Soldiers of Odin, who have taken it upon themselves to kind of police areas where because they feel that kind of migrant or refugee populations are in quotes problematic. So that sort of shift towards more street-based vigilante style tactics away from the ballot box has been particular area of concern globally.
Great, thank you. So we have the mainstreaming, the transnationalism, and the shift to kind of some of the vigilante and violent tactics. I wonder if one of the follow-ups coming out of that might be about responses, both from the private sector and the public sector. And I know we're going to get into higher education in a few minutes, but I'm just thinking about even in the last 24, 36 hours, some of the news coming out of Austria around the possible connection between whether the identitarians should be banned, whether Martin Sellner was connected in some way with the New Zealand terrorist, had received a donation, but also Facebook banning content. And so I wonder if any of you want to comment on, what is the role of governments with the knowledge of what's happening on so many different dimensions, the mainstreaming, the transnational cooperations, external interference, and some of the more violent fringes becoming more active. Is there a playbook of strategies? Is there a top 5 that governments or the private sector should be engaging in?
I mean, I guess I would say I certainly agree there's a transnationalization of radical right ideas and the connections, logistics, and what have you. But many of the responses are still very much nestled within the nation state, and that is as it must be, at least in our post-Westphalian kind of order. And that means that, for example, after the horrors of New Zealand only a couple of weeks ago, Facebook saw 1.5 million shares of that live streamed video of mass murder over 24 hours. That's really quite shocking. But where it didn't happen was in Germany, because the platform faces a 50 million euro fine for incitement or hate speech, which is placed on its platform within the context of Germany. Now that's what we didn't see in the United Kingdom, we didn't see in the United States, because those laws are not in place. So in a sense, we still have very much a transnational activism of radical right extremism, but we still very much have national responses, and that seems to be a mismatch.
But I do think there is some sense of, even in what we're doing with CAR, there is an international scholarly community that can respond in different ways. And, when you look at, for example, the European Union, I have to mention my book, Legislating Equality, there was a sense that the EU as a group had to respond to, for example, your Tiger in the late 90s when his party was successful. And unfortunately, we've lost that. So there was a playbook in place, at least in the EU, to say, okay, if there's these, far-right actions, violence, Jewish cemeteries being attacked, immigrant and refugee hostels being attacked, we have to respond. Now, that's kind of what we've lost. And actually, the book, covers a time period when, we did have this kind of push for anti-discrimination policy and the government would take action, and then we had conservative governments come into play, and you saw those governments, it ties into what we were talking about earlier, you saw those conservative governments saying, oh, multiculturalism has failed, and we need to take a step back. And so then I was like, wait a second, we had a playbook and now it's gone. And so, what can take its place? And I think from the perspective of activists and others, we're still trying to figure out how do we play the game in this situation where things have gone so far to the right that we have mainstream politicians saying things that they would have been shocked to hear even from the far right 20 years ago.
And I mean, in my research, and it's mainly looking at kind of mainstream politicians and how they respond to anti-Islam groups in the UK, what I would perhaps argue for is more localised responses. So not just attacking these issues at a macro level, top down, but a more micro level kind of response to some of these, some of the drivers of these protest groups. So in the UK at least, locally, these groups get support where there's permissive environments, where sort of kind of prejudice is left to circulate and fester and isn't kind of challenged by outside kind of influences. So I mean, there's some other kind of factors which drive that sometimes there's polarization between white majority communities and kind of minority communities. Sometimes there's issues of some people not being kind of represented in the mainstream kind of system. But it's about trying to, in terms of a state response, kind of tap into and kind of breaking those bubbles of kind of localized permissiveness around.
Yeah, because I do think there's situations where you have seen cities and even U.S. states take on these issues outside of the federal or even international system. And so I do think that's very true, that you can have local responses that address these issues. And it's almost, I come back to the issue of norms, because if you can't get laws, then you have to have norms. And if you have communities that have norms around these things and can kind of police them themselves, then that's another approach to dealing with it.
One of the things that strikes me, and of course I have my time with a hat as a professor of education, so I think a lot about education and educational responses and interventions, but it seems to me that, even in the way that we're discussing it here, a lot of times what we talk about are reactive solutions that are after the fact, or that are about kind of how to respond when things happen. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on, is it possible to have preventative solutions and what those look like, or whether there are examples of best practices coming out of countries that have dealt with this for even longer or have been more responsive earlier than this country has been, let's say.
I guess I just make a very brief response to that in terms of campuses. Campuses historically were not hospitable places for the radical right. They were not places where the radical right felt comfortable, certainly post-1945. And that's something that's changed relatively recently. We saw Adam Wofford, for example, the neo-Nazi group, putting stickers and flyers up at campuses. Generation Identity, certainly both in Europe and the United States, has been active in recruiting that kind of 18 to 29, 30-year-old, many of which are college students, but not only. So I think that's a relatively new phenomenon where we're seeing a real attempt to move into campuses. And I do think it's time to think intermediate and long term rather than simply reacting, because we're putting band-aids on problems that are only just metastasizing.
Okay, I'm gonna put you on the spot, since you've been in the provost seat, and in a vice presidential role in a campus, you know, and been the leader. You know, do you think that campus leaders can or should be doing things differently in a preventative way? And or any other comments about preventative education, really, in higher ed sector or in other levels?
Yeah, I think, absolutely. I mean, so one of the things that, I mean, we do often get taken by surprise because, you know, you don't expect a Charlottesville to happen. And so there are going to be situations where it's going to be hard to figure, you can't necessarily see what's going to happen ahead. But, you know, some of the things we did, you know, in the summer of 2016, I believe it was, there was the whole Black Lives Matter and things going on around that. And so we did try to be proactive in the sense that, you know, I set up a forum. It's just been a very emotional time period. And I said, let's have a forum where we're bringing people from the community and students and just talk, you know. And sometimes that's what it takes, is just saying, oh my God, there's all these things going on. We just need a safe place to come and talk about. And actually it was a really great thing. And so then that encourages students to become more engaged and say, okay, we're going to do, you know, these things regularly. And, you know, we created, a lot of universities are now creating, you know, committees on diversity, not just diversity, I don't want to just use that term, because it's more around education in the sense that we want to bring in speakers like Ibram Kendi to talk about these things. So we had a whole series of speakers coming through that, you know, if we hadn't been thinking proactively, we might not have necessarily focused, you know, we were a business college, so we weren't necessarily focused on, you know, bringing in speakers to talk about, but all of these things tie in. I mean, we need to be sure that we're training our students in a way to understand, you know, Silicon Valley has a huge issue with diversity. And so our students need to understand what the underlying factors are that have led to that, as well as what they can do to be more, because we had a very diverse student body, that, you know, if they want to feel welcome in those spaces or to, you know, be able to be effective in those spaces. And so one thing, you know, you know, you hate to have to focus on the people who are being marginalized and put the onus on them to do the work, but, you know, we're in a situation, unfortunately, where that's still part of what we have to do. But we also have to make sure that we're pulling in the students who, you know, need the education. And so, I mean, I would love to see more work being done in higher education that kind of looks at the, you know, requires more of an understanding of the spaces that we are in, whether it's American University or the University of Texas at Austin that just got rid of their Confederate statues, or, you know, the University of California, Berkeley, that has all kinds of things going on that, yeah, we could talk about for hours. So.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of when I teach undergraduate classes, I think it's really important to be able to equip students with kind of the knowledge and awareness of some of these groups in a way that they can kind of challenge and engage with some of the narratives that they kind of portray, have become, and just kind of outlining how they become mainstream. Me and Matthew, we're starting, we can start a project looking at foreign counter-narratives kind of globally. But yeah, I think being able to kind of make people aware, be able to kind of critically engage with those narratives is quite essential. I'm reminded of the point I think Shannon said on the previous panel about this whole issue of blackface and how people perhaps were unaware of the kind of racist connotations in history. We perhaps shouldn't be having to educate people about that, but sometimes, and I'm aware of this, especially with like Holocaust education, we have to teach things in a fresh way to make people aware of some of the history that kind of has motivated some of these movements.
I would just mention one more thing, is, so for example, we started doing some field trips to like the places where, Angel Island, where Japanese immigrants were held. And it's actually very moving because you go into this building where they were being held, and you can see the writings in they wrote poems in Japanese on the walls. So things like that where you can actually give people a sense of this isn't just history. This is something that happened not that long ago. And so I think that's the kind of education we can do that gives them a visceral sense of what was really going on that can be helpful.
Yeah, and I would add to that just myself, I think some of the everyday practices that are common in places like Canada, for example, of acknowledging the indigenous communities that lived on the land. Right here, there was an indigenous community living right on this land that are hardly ever acknowledged on the campus as part of the history of this land. And I think, I think that one of the things I wonder is, are there strategies that are so overlooked in their kind of everyday potential, because they're not just a destination or a curriculum, but could change kind of everyday practices. And are there examples, and I don't know if there are other examples like that, but it seems to me that there should be, but that part of what that might require is more education of adults, right, over the life course. And so that's more of a comment than a question, but I don't know if you have anything to add to, on that point, on examples of how communities are engaging these issues that get outside of formal classrooms or particular educational initiatives.
I mean, one interesting thing, I'm a one-trick pony. I look at these anti-Islam groups and responses to them. One of the interesting things that anti-racist groups do in the UK is that when they come, every activist, they donate money back to like the mosque that they're demonstrating against. So there's quite innovative kind of ways, if you're more inclined to kind of engage in this activism, to kind of push back. And that's one kind of interesting way of sort of crowdfunding, or kind of supporting people who are impacted by this sort of activism. What do you guys think?
Well, the example I would use is, I have two sons who are teenagers, and my husband and I, we really enjoy visiting historical sites and national parks. And so last summer we did the Civil War sites. We started here in DC, went down to Richmond, and then over to Monticello. And so I wish we would encourage more, especially more people of color, Black and Asian and so on, because there's all these, I mean, even Angel Island is I can't remember if it's a state or a national park. But in any case, one of the things that impressed me is in, the many years of visiting the parks is, for example, some of the Civil War sites, now they actually acknowledge the role of African American troops. And, I said, wow, I don't feel so strange, coming to these sites anymore because my history is now represented. And, I think it's very important that, our kids get to see that. And so there are things like that where you actually have the Park Service and others, acknowledging that history and incorporating it into the displays and the way we talk about it. And even Monticello these days is, almost every aspect of it is infused with the slavery issue, which I found very encouraging. But it's also, that's something I've done with my kids, and we need to be able to make sure that that education is getting out there.
I have a question really directed toward Matthew, but for everyone. I wonder, before we move into the second set of questions around higher ed, if you could talk just a little bit about, since CARD, Center for Analysis of Radical Right, has been, by mission, kind of connecting scholarship with the media. One of the critiques that folks from who don't work on the radical right sometimes have of scholars and journalists who work on the radical right is that we're doing more harm than good. And we have thousands of people watching us. So for Livestream, we have a large audience out there, and I know Rand Media, our partner here, also faces these same kinds of critiques. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that critique, about what it means to bring to light extremist views, and where the lines get drawn, even just the question of sharing the manifesto, or sharing images, or sharing the name of the terrorist, have been, of course, very much topics of conversation over the last week or two.
Yeah, and it's a hot issue, and it's a deeply ethical issue. I guess I'd start probably from a pretty basic proposition, which is that knowledge is a good. And we're in the game of knowledge production, as it were, and I tend to part company with people who think that knowledge is not a good. Sometimes knowledge can, of course, be detached and dispassionate, but sometimes it can be very, very close to the skin, as it were. And one looks at, let's say, historical radical right or extremist groups, and that might be within living memory, but that's still a fair way away from groups that might turn up to campus or that might threaten ethnic, religious, or sexual minorities, which have always been and will always be the MO of the radical right. People who look or sound or act or believe different from what the perceived majority is. And that, to me, is a question of education, of calling that out, of saying that all cultures themselves have differences within them. So in a sense, whether we want to call it multicultural with a capital M or not, we are talking about multiple cultures and backgrounds and experiences. So I suppose that would be my first point. The second, coming slightly out of left field, but in perhaps the headier days of my more left-wing youth, I was very critical of gatekeepers in education, gatekeepers in the media, gatekeepers, for example, in any elites, which we might call. But one of the things that social media has done is really removed some of those gatekeepers. And it's ironic that I sometimes miss that when it's gone, because of course one can really just swim in the hatred on social media and Twitter and so forth. And it does need, I think, reasonable and responsible voices like Rand and some of our media partners that we're so keen to work with in disseminating an accessible understanding about the radical right, because scholars are very good at talking to each other, and that's important, and that's a way that we learn. But I think that we also have a responsibility to talk to the public. And one of the things that I would suggest about social media removing gatekeepers is it does allow individuals who wish to swim in hate 24/7. And the idea that if you're swimming in hate 24/7, if you, as it were, climb out of the pool, that you're not soaking wet in that hate in the real world, seems to me absurd and unrealistic.
Yeah, I would agree with what Matthew said. You know, it's funny because when this issue came up, I was like, oh my gosh, should I really have put Jean-Marie Le Pen on the cover of my first book, you know, because I'm giving him publicity. But, you know, the reality is, unfortunately, not that many people read that book. So, outside of academia, for sure. But what I've been able to do, though, you know, in more recent years is, you know, I've had a couple of posts in the Washington Post Monkey Cage blog that talks about my research in a way that's, you know, accessible to the public and talks about actually the colonial cemetery and the fact that it's gone away and so on. And so I guess I would just say that, you know, there is a way to talk about these issues and, you know, these groups without glorifying them or saying that this is the mainstream, right? Actually, you know, the more we can do to educate more broadly around the ways to approach these issues and so on is really critical, because I have a deep knowledge of, you know, what's been going on with these parties over many years and the, you know, European systems, and you know, to hold back on that because I think that, you know, it's going to glorify them is very problematic, because it's I'm not sharing, you know, we need to be sharing our understanding of these things. But, you know, I also try to approach it in a broader way, because, you know, my second book kind of took off from what happened with, you know, I focused on the radical right up through the early 2000s, and then, you know, focused more on kind of the impact. And so I think it's important that, you know, for me as a scholar, it was important to not just look at the radical right, but also look at the impact at things like anti-discrimination policy. You know, if we are only looking at the radical right, that's one thing, but we're putting them in context and saying what's happening to the broader party systems, what's happening to policy, you know, then I think it's you know, less problematic.
Well, can I ask you the same question, but also maybe you can add to that, since you are leading a project on counter-narratives kind of globally against the radical right, that's I think could have a big impact. I know this is a particular issue in counter-narratives too, in terms of who gets to see them, and, you know, how can you create counter narratives without actually providing information to extremist groups that they then can use to further manipulate.
Yeah, I mean, what the radical right has become particularly good at is engaging with the media, and they know the narratives which sell, and they know their issue around things like immigration and kind of racial politics very well. So just linking to one of my concerns about some of these radical right ideologues in the media is that often interviewers in the media aren't as kind of critical or knowledgeable about the topic. So they go into it perhaps in a slightly naive way. So when I've seen good interviews with people like, I perhaps wouldn't put, I would say Nigel Farage is radical right, but there was a very good interview on radio, so he's the leader of the UK Independence, former leader of the UK Independence Party, where the interviewer had researched his kind of background very well, and was able to kind of deconstruct some of his positions on immigration. So I think that, so is that having that skilled and knowledgeable interviewer is quite helpful. And I mean, sometimes these actors do it themselves. So in the UK, we had the rise of a neo-fascist party called the British National Party in the 2000s. And what burst the bubble of that rise was their leader, Nick Griffin, going on a mainstream panel show in the UK and espousing some of his fairly bizarre and crazy views on the Holocaust and on racial politics. So sometimes they do it for people who oppose these groups, but usually it revolves around a more knowledgeable and kind of smart interviewer.
I would just say, but I think part of the problem with people saying, we shouldn't glorify the radical right, so it is that they're looking at what the media is doing. And I would agree completely with Will that the part of the problem has been that you have these interviewers who, can't critically, go after these people when they make, conspiracy theories and so on. So I think academia is less the problem than the media in this instance, in that, we're trying to put out the facts and, and actually, I would hope that, and we have our partnership with Rent Media, that we would be doing more to interact with the media to help them, make these interviews, more, real, because a lot of these media interviews are just, they're very much catering to the message that these actors are bringing to the table, rather than challenging them on their facts or the statements they make that are clearly out of line. And so I think that it's a combination of, we need to be informing and even being part of putting our I try to write at least a couple of columns or posts a week that I can provide background information. I can say I can lay out the facts in a way that a typical radio or TV interviewer might not have.
And just to kind of praise Terry and the work that she does, it's not just talking to the usual suspects, but to a wider group of people. I think that's so important. And I also think that Will touches on a very important issue about Nick Griffin, if I could just kind of parse that for a moment. I'm all for having ironclad principles, for example, non-negotiable veneration for the dignity of the person. But I think that sometimes that becomes ironclad tactics. And I think that tactics need to be subtle, or supple even. And I'll give you one example. Nick Griffin was and still is, he's just a buffoon, frankly. He's not a very good spokesperson for even his white nationalist movement. So he was on this program because his party had received in the 2009 European elections nearly 1 million votes. And he was going on about David Duke, how some people in the KKK aren't so bad. This was something that really brought about the decline, there were other factors, but brought about the decline of the British National Party because he went on national television and he showed himself to be someone, that clearly was racist, I think, in most people's eyes. My point is actually a more simple one, which is if we then have an ironclad tactic that says sunlight is always the best disinfectant, no matter who it is, under any circumstances, well, I think that there are people, for example, like Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, aka Tony Robinson, who is a more able spokesperson. And I think that trick probably, I shouldn't call it a trick, I think that tactic probably wouldn't work to the same effect. So I think that if we have these ironclad rules where we say we always are going to put a radical right speaker on a TV panel and have them be interrogated, well, sometimes it's going to work and sometimes it's not. And I oftentimes ask people, what if Nick Griffin had acquitted himself brilliantly on that program and had seen his movement double? Then we would all be saying we have to absolutely no platform them on any and every occasion. And so it seems to me that no platforming at times and in certain places absolutely works. As an ironclad rule, I think we have to be very careful. Ironclad principles are important. Ironclad rules seem to me that they can also be counterproductive.
So we're going to move in a few minutes into question and answer, but I want to just close our panel with the second question that I promised you I'd ask, which is, action-oriented strategies for universities. So are there things that you think, or maybe even one thing, that you would think universities should be doing either to respond to the rise of the radical right among young people or to better equip young people who are graduating, our undergraduate and our graduate students, to address these challenges? Again, our teachers in training, our medical professionals in training, folks going out there in the world. What can universities be doing? What's their role?
As the educator and administrator, one thing that we did, both at University of Texas and at Menlo College, was really to give the students some agency, especially the students who might feel marginalized, and make sure that, first of all, they felt they were seen, and that they had avenues for expression and so on. And that's something we just need to be doing more generally. But to be honest, higher ed has not been very intentional about what we do around, especially the demographic change we have seen in the last 20 years. And when I got to Menlo College, we I noticed, in 2015 we had a very diverse student body. But, that student body had gone from, 2005 to 2015 from being majority white to majority minority. And it was not intentional at all. That's just the demographics of California. But I was like, okay, everybody, what are we doing about this? And so, in the space of the 3 years I was there, we had to implement all these different programs. And so it's really not something you can do that's generic. You have to look at your campus, and the leadership has to be willing to, show some empathy really around what is going on your particular campus, and say, and work with students and work with faculty and work with staff and say, what are the things that we can do as a community that are going to give our students some agency around these issues so that they can make the choices they need to make going forward. And so what I found was probably the most important thing there was to bring the student voice in.
And I just add, I completely agree with Harry, but I would suggest again, as a sort of basic point, knowledge can be transformative and knowledge can be democratic, but that is not just for students. The idea that once their instructors or their administrators have achieved positions of influence or PhDs, that they somehow stop learning, that their picture of the world is frozen in time is of course a clearly absurd one. And I think that, myself included, that is a kind of a learning journey. And that can embrace things like diversity, that can embrace things like new political facts that come to emergence. The idea that instructors and administrators don't also learn and don't also have a learning curve that they need to respect. seems to me the height of hubris.
So, I mean, going back to perhaps the previous questions, I come from a university where they have a fairly strong no platform rule for far-right speakers, which has worked pretty well in terms of preventing these groups on campus. And I think that's quite helpful. I mean, perhaps pushing back a bit on what Matt says. But I feel that the predominant politics in UK universities at the moment is sort of the more radical left variety, and that can who kind of sort of advocate these no platform policies. But I think also that can be quite negative because so it Leeds, where I'm from, there was kind of a vote in March about more robust tactics against anti-Semitism on campus. And so anti-Semitism usually probably associated with the far right, but actually in England at the moment it's become a problem of the left more broadly, because basically being pro-Palestine sometimes slips into being anti-Israel, and then that can lead on in some instances to being anti-Semitic. So I just use that kind of example because, again, that probably goes back to what Matt was saying in terms of the problem about ironclad kind of tactics, is that more inflexible kind of mindset can be a hindrance to more progressive kind of politics. So people need to be, on the left, need to be self-aware about how that can mutate into something quite regressive for religious minorities on campus.
I have plenty more questions I could ask, but I want to take a round of questions from our audience. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask of the panelists? Yes, in the back. And we have, microphones. Thank you. I think the one, maybe we could take the one out of the way. Thank you.
Who was it?
Just in the very back, yeah.
So my classmate and I are working on a project, and we decided to work on a project together after the Charlottesville incident, and looking at how we can, we're in a graduate program, and looking at how can we look at dealing with racial aggression and injustice. And we wanted to do it across the DMV, but realized initially we actually had to start in our own institution to be able to do that. The question that I have for you, you all talked a lot about information and awareness. We're dealing a lot with how do we measure what we're doing. So how do you all deal with that in your area? You talked about you're in the business program, but this is still really important. So what do you hope to accomplish in doing these things as far as bringing information and awareness to the students?
When you talk about data, do you mean in terms of are we actually having an impact? Yes, okay. That's a huge topic in higher ed these days. And, we're really in the early stages of that. Is how do you know you actually have the impact you think you have? And obviously the main tool we have right now is surveys. And, we know how difficult those are. And, we talked about at Menlo College doing a climate survey, but it was difficult because we had we only had 750 students, and you can't do a real robust analysis with that few students. And so, I wish I had a good answer for you, but I think, one approach is to figure out what outcomes you want, first of all. And so, figuring out the outcomes, and then the second step is to say, can we measure these outcomes? And the third step is to actually do the analysis. And there are some tools developing out there. So we're in the School of Education, so I'm sure Cynthia can give us some ideas. But I have to say more broad, so I have a lot because I'm just starting the Center for Higher Education Leadership. The first, we're going to have guides every other month, and the first one is on assessment because nobody understands what assessment is. And I have to say, there's an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed that was talking about, oh, we need to just ditch assessment and all this stuff. I'm like, oh my God, here's another clear example of how you do not understand what assessment is. I wanted to send this guy my guide to assessment because it's not about figuring out can students think critically. It's about, are we teaching them what we actually say we're teaching them? And so I agree with what you're trying to do. It's just, at least in my world of higher ed, where there's so many of us who come at this without a background in education, in pedagogy, and all these things that, I'm a political scientist, we have not really learned. And so I have to rely on staff people and others to be able to understand how we can do these kinds of things. And, we're just happy to get the students in the room and getting them listening to speakers and things. It's because that is such a hard thing to do, is to actually get the students' attention. And if you guys can figure out a way to get the students' attention, even food. I've had pizza, it is literally these days so hard to get the students in the room. And I know it's because they're working, it's because they have so many other obligations, and so we're working in an environment where it's just really hard to, if you're doing something that is adding to what the students have to do. One of my most successful events was because the Black Student Union organized it, and they were having one of their regular meetings anyway, and so we kind of tagged on to that. And there was food and all that, but like I said, we've offered pizza, and we can't get students to come. So I think the bigger challenge is getting them in the room, and then figuring out how do we really assess have they taken on what we expected them to take on.
I'm just going to put on my education hat, scholar hat for a minute, not my moderator hat, and say that the same questions that you're asking are the questions that the very best scholars in the country are asking. So you're right there with us. And I would say, Terry's come to a meeting that we're having here at AU, hosting, about 15 scholars of race and immigration and far-right radicalization and education to just start scratching the surface of this question. What would an intervention look like? What would a national intervention look like? What would mean success? What's measurable in terms of outcomes? Are we talking about empathy? Are we talking about better cross-cultural communication skills? Right? What are the things? How would we measure it? Where should we do it? Rural, suburban, urban areas. I mean, and so the number of questions that we have to even begin to think about interventions is astronomical. And so I can tell you that if this topic excites you, get in touch with me. I have the easiest email in the world. It's cynthia@american.edu, which now I realize there's thousands of people on Livestream. And not just you, but yeah, it's all right. It's easy to find anyway. But would love to have you be a part of it because it's, I think it's the most exciting thing I've done in my career. I can't believe Terry said yes to come, which is great. And everybody I asked said yes to come. And we just have a great group coming. And it is the most hopeful thing, I think, seen on the horizon. But also, the number of questions that are unresolved is astronomical, right? And I think the fact that we're just so much at the beginning of understanding what we don't know means that it's your generation who is going to bring us hope in this. All we can do is start to set some of the groundwork and lay it in place, but we're really going to need a generation of work on this. I'll stop talking now and go back to moderation. Brian, question from you, or yeah, the question in the back and then Brian in the front.
Hello, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise with us today. I'm on one of the advisory committees for diversity and inclusion at AU, and something that was surprising to us is that when we were looking at decolonizing curriculum in that subject, we did a survey of our professors And there's actually a lot of, even though we didn't use that terminology, but we used the terminology of how have you been doing in terms of diversifying the sources that you have on your syllabi. And there's immediate concern and kind of some backlash from professors saying, we're kind of concerned about administration interfering in the way we're teaching from that question. And it wasn't even, it was just an anonymous survey. And another thing they said was, we already have to teach the canon, we don't have time to include other sources. And then lastly, they were saying that we also just don't have time in terms of our professional, like how do we have time to do all this extra work? So I'm kind of wondering about solutions to this, and also how to get into the heart of what is that kind of immediate concern to diversifying the curriculum.
Right, I was going to college in the early to mid 80s, and we learned Western civilization and Western culture, all that. And not long after that came the push to really, I'll use your terminology, decolonize, those kinds of courses to make them more broad and so on. And obviously there was the same kind of pushback. And so this has been going on for a long time, is my point. But what I see happening is it's not my generation, it's the generation right behind me that has more women, more minorities, et cetera, that are saying, okay, we're just gonna start having some norms around, even, not having males, as we call them, we're gonna have, instead of having, 4 men up here, we're gonna have 2 women and 2 men and an African-American woman and so on. And so what we're starting to see is a shift in the norms around that, and unfortunately that's probably gonna have to be the way it goes. Administrators cannot dictate, to a certain extent, what faculty teach, unless it's something like an introductory culture course for freshmen or something like that. So, but I do see some hope from that perspective, that in political science at least, there is a discussion going on about making sure your syllabi, looking at your syllabus and seeing how many women and if it's, people of color are on that syllabus, and I'm trying to make it easy for them when you're studying the immigration and the radical rights. You can actually get an African-American woman on your syllabus. But, so there's a lot of different ways you can approach it, and one way is to say, oh look, if you want, actually, get in touch with me. I have some material around that. We did a study called Political Science in the 21st Century, where actually our American Political Science Association took on this issue of how should we be approaching all these issues around race and diversity and immigration and so on in the 21st century, given the changes. And you can approach it from the perspective of, look, the demographics have changed. For goodness sake, you're in, the Washington, D.C. metro area is one of the most diverse, especially in terms of immigrants and so on. And so if you can approach it from the perspective of, look, the demographics are changing, we've got a lot of immigrants, we need to make sure that they can identify with the way you're approaching these issues. And, I know, I work, it's funny, on Twitter a lot, we have a lot of connections with younger scholars, which is really rewarding. And so it's really helpful to have those of us who've kind of gotten up to be more senior in our professions to say, look, we are here, we are resources, we are happy to help. And that's why I agreed to be part of this group with Cynthia, because this is, obviously a huge passion of mine to make sure that we, I'm not saying you have to change your entire syllabus, but look and see, can you, and actually people in our political science listserv are asking, hey, how can I add more women to my syllabus? How can I add more people of color to my syllabus? So there's all kinds of ways you can approach this that are more, like I said, more changing of the norms than me as provost coming in and saying, you better change your syllabus, which is not, I would never do that, because I firmly believe in, academic freedom and for faculty to be able to teach the way they want to teach, but encouragement, there's some, and it's really good quality stuff out there is what is important to understand. We're not asking you to make undermine what you've been doing all these years. We're asking you to just be current and know what's out there.
I would just add to that one of the things that helped bring bring the mantle to an end, which is the all-male panel, was the fact that men started refusing to participate in panels if they were all male. And so it also requires, it requires the active engagement of those who hold the privilege and power to interrupt and turn over those norms. And I think political science is a great example, because not only did men do that, but then this Women Also Know Stuff group got started, and then a couple of very powerful men in our field. I'm a sociologist, but Kasmuda, who has been a tireless advocate of diversifying knowledge in the field, just started a slide that at the end of every talk, practically he puts up that says, here's 12 women you should be asking to speak instead of me. And then after an event, like Christchurch happens or New Zealand happens, he just tweets that out, like, stop asking me for interviews, here's some other people you should be asking instead. And honestly, that's probably half the media that I do probably comes from that list. I've had invitations to write articles out of that list. I think you're on that list too. So it's, and it's people who hold power that also have, so we have to have these pushes from marginalized communities, but we also have to really call on allies to push when they hold power and privilege as well. Brian, you had a question.
Thanks so much to our panel. This was really great. We heard some talk about the use of local solutions to address this issue of sort of the transnational far right, and I think that some of the most compelling success stories that we hear of de-radicalization from the extreme right are relational approaches. Right, I'm thinking of like Chris Piccolini's work and some of the organizations like his. Higher education is inherently local and it's inherently relational. So then the question that I'm asking you is, how do we address the issue of scalability? Or what challenges surround this issue of scalability?
Could I just respond briefly? I mean, I tend to think one of the things we have to avoid is siloing knowledge out, whether it's disciplinary or regional or even linguistically. Best practice, let's share it, right? So one of the things that I was really inspired by, I live in the north of England, but Edinburgh had a local charter for kicking out hate crime and bias on its public transport. And it was a citywide solution. Now again, that is the city of Edinburgh, but there's no reason that if it works and there are certain aspects that you can have to make it work better, maybe some buses or trains have CCTV and others don't. Definitely there are issues that aren't necessarily replicable right across the country or the world, but it still seems to me that if it works and if there is enough evidence, and I think being evidence-led is quite important here, to be able to extend that elsewhere and say, hey, look, it works over here. We might have different challenges. We might have more trains than buses or cars or whatever it is, but this template works. How might we be able to apply it to our particular context? And so to me, part of that, the unlocking of that, I tend to think, is sharing best practice. Rather than holding it to ourselves or trying to slap a copyright on it, the things that actually make being citizens in our shared world better, easier, more honorable, dare I say, are precisely those kinds of things that should be shared.
I'll just add that, yeah, I agree that it's a sharing of knowledge, and part of the problem right now is that there's a tendency for example, here in the U.S. to be very U.S.-centric and not, but there's a lot of really good solutions or ideas around how to de-radicalization and so on that are happening in Europe. And for example, the city of Hamburg in Germany has had some really progressive policies for incorporating immigrants. The city of Berlin has some interesting programs. So I think that actually the work we're doing may be one of the answers, right? That we actually get together, bring together the research, talk about what's going on. But there has been some of this work, there's the Cities of Migration program that at least is trying to address some of the issues. And so actually that has been spreading best practices around. So for example, when I was in Texas, City of Austin had an immigrants council. Well, that's something that came over from Europe and was part of the Cities of Migration program project, was they were trying to spread around these best practices for working with immigrants, for working with host countries. There are all these programs that Mexico and has been working with different cities to help with the transitions for Mexican immigrants and so on. So I do think that's happening. We may just not hear about it as much.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I would endorse that point in terms of best practice. In the UK, what's interesting about anti-Islam protests that's publicly kind of disclosed is that police forces who had previously had demonstrations by one of these groups will actively seek out other cities where they successfully dealt with it and learn from police officers there. So that's more localised. It's part of that learning, so that other places don't need to start from scratch, which is quite important. And another thing, just to plug the toolbox that Matthew and I are going to start developing, is around that piece of sharing kind of knowledge and best practice. So the outcomes of the project will be available to practitioners and interested people. So yeah, that will hopefully kind of contribute to
Just two follow-up points based on Will's research, and perhaps I'm misunderstanding either. You're kind of asking for some specifics, but just in terms of those street-type protests, just to give two examples. One of the things that happened, the English Defence League, which was one of the first of this new generation of kind of street-based movements, is, as you can imagine, they had a lot of counter-protesters. Okay? Now, irrespective of whether you think that's a good idea or not, when you have them in close proximity to the protesters, you're going to get violence and you're going to get, that. So you keep them away from each other. A second one that's like, again, once you reflect upon it, it's pretty obvious, but you don't necessarily want them marching through the center of your town and bringing everything to a standstill. Sure, people have a democratic right to protest, but there are places for doing that. These seem to me the kinds of things that somebody does a trial and error, but either you're going to keep reinventing the wheel, you're going to turn around and say, well, actually, let's keep these groups away. Or if you've got a hate group coming and they have a constitutional right to protest, there's no reason that they don't have to be 10 miles out from the city center and have their protest in a parking lot or whatever it is. It's not just, to me, and I think there's two things there. One is that somebody comes up with these things and they work, but then I think for them not to reinvent the wheel and to have big setbacks, it's to share that knowledge. And I think that can be one of the challenges. Although there, as we all know, social media and the internet has transformed many parts of our lives. One of the things that's transformed is the ability to share best practice and knowledge, not just different regions in a country, but transnationally, globally. And I think that's something we really, all of us as educators, should double down on.
Is there another question from the audience at this time? If not, I will jump, yes, over here. Yes.
Hi there, guys. Thank you again for being here. I have the awesome fortune of being Cynthia's research assistant, so this has become a topic that I've become very interested in. And so in her book, she talks about this kind of scale of, when we think of far right, we often think of the very far radical, the Charlottesville, the anti-Muslim, but we don't often realize there's these different levels, from people wearing shirts with like racist iconography to just, I hang around people that are on the far right, but I don't fully associate it. Within the context of the United States, where there is kind of, it's a little muddy right now, do we think that there's a space or an initiative or a policy that can reach the far-reaching levels of far right, people that identify as far right or people in the middle? And is higher education too late to reach those people in that population?
So that's a tough question because, it kind of comes back to this issue of the mainstreaming of these discourses and so on. And, I would say that we haven't really gotten to the point where we're very effective because so much of this is entwined with things like religion and, the way parents are raising their kids. So, it's something really that I think needs to start, obviously, in K through 12. And there are, initiatives around things like bullying and so on. But I don't think we quite yet come up with a really good approach in higher education. Because partly, and I say this with love in my heart for academia, we don't necessarily see ourselves as responsible for, I mean, we do and we don't, right? So there are those of us, and I would say most faculty, the grants teachers, we do things like this. This is something that we are doing to try to deal with these issues. On the other hand, we don't, there aren't, I think this is a graduate school, but still, how much of this is getting out to the people who need it? And I can say probably not much. So we have not figured out how to really do this in a way that gets to the age group that needs it. And so that's an area where we need to do some work, because by the time they get to college, a lot of these things are ingrained, and even where they choose to go to college can be impacted by those things that happen to them in K through 12. So we can develop. So I think the initiatives we've done, like working with the media, are important and critical. This is something we need to be forever engaged in. But we also need to figure out how do we get to the people. I don't know yet if there's a real solution for getting to the people who aren't going to be open to this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, coming off sort of Terry's point in terms of kind of young people, I think it relates to what the previous panel was saying in terms of just greater digital literacy. Because obviously the online space is a space where a lot of young people, including myself, spend a lot of time. So it's developing those kind of critical thinking skills, and to not take things like a video shared by, say, like a radical right influencer or activist at face value, that it's actually being, it's a piece of, perhaps propaganda is too strong a word, but it's being curated in a way which is designed to have a particular message attached to it, which might take you from something which is very mainstream to something very niche and extreme. So yeah, I think having those sort of built into curricula is quite helpful, and hopefully by the time that people get to college, they've already learned that anyway. But that, I guess, needs to be reinforced.
I would just add that I think, I know that my faculty colleagues and dean in the School of Education would agree with me on this. So it's not that I'm just throwing out critique against my own school, but in general, schools of education have not done a very good job. And I think, and this is, as Ibram Kendi was saying earlier, that thinking really differently about what teacher preparation looks like, and what professional development for teachers looks like, so that that these kinds of issues are just hard baked into the way that we teach teachers to teach. It's certainly just not been the norm, and has relied on individual faculty to teach in those ways, which just means it's very happenstance. And I think what we're left with then, and again, as a parent of kids in public schools here in DC, every time there's an event, a terrible terrorist attack event, shooting, one of the things that shocks me the most is the fact that it doesn't get brought up in school, right? That the teachers don't address it. And I know they don't address it because they don't know how to address it, and they're afraid to address it in a polarizing way. But the teachers are affected too, right? They're affected by these same issues, and they need training, and it's our responsibility as higher education institutions, I think, to start bringing some of this knowledge. And I think this is part of the intent of these meetings that are going to start in May, to start bringing some of this knowledge into practice. We've been working very hard with the media to educate journalists. We're talking about educating journalists, but we also need to educate teachers, both future, pre-service teachers and those who are in service. And And it's really just been very, very neglected. So I would say that's one place to start.
I would also say it's been neglected for higher education administrators as well. You know, we tend to come from, for those of us who come from the faculty, we come in with our own, understanding of political science or chemistry or whatever, but we don't have any, we don't really know much about pedagogy or how to deal with a lot of issues. And so that's one of the reasons I'm starting my company and starting to try and do more around professional development. But, you know, it's really interesting because you've seen so many college presidents who have lost their jobs in the last couple of years because they did not know how to deal with these kind of crises. Or they ran into, you know, you think about the chancellor of UNC, she just went and got a job at USC, so she's got more scandals to deal with. But you know, she basically lost her job because she, you know, agreed with the students to get rid of the Silent Sam statue. And so I think there's instances where boards of trustees, you know, presidents, et cetera, aren't prepared for, you know, not just crises, but just these issues more generally.
I had a question. First, an idea on that, maybe like a DARE, remember DARE? Do that, but for racism, maybe? Educate kids, just a slight idea. But my question was on media, given that's what I'm obsessed with and what you know, I've worked with all of you in publishing articles and essentially well, before the question, just some framing, I mean, the radical right, they don't call it the radical right. And that's what I think is one of the definitive problems, because they're afraid of conservative media's critiques, and they don't want to be perceived as biased, and there's the false equivalency that they then create. Because I mean, if there was communist terrorists or so, you know, we would call it radical left, it wouldn't mince words. So how do you bridge that gap? I ask this because you've been, you know, aside from with us, been working with a lot of other media organizations. What do you think, other than like a seismic paradigm shift, would cause these media organizations to cover the threat? Because right now we're seeing more attacks than ISIS, and yet it's not. The Australian Prime Minister called it right-wing extremism, and yet our media calls it, well, they call it white supremacy, which is fine, but you know, they need to call it by its name. Question, what do you think is necessary to do that, aside from, you know, of course, educating journalists?
That's a really difficult question. I guess my first observation is exactly what you said. Let's call it by its name. And I think that this unwillingness to call things by their name doesn't help anyone. The second is I tend to think that there's a binary thinking going on sometimes. So one of the things that we have seen for radical right or right-wing extremism has been lone actors. I just think it's a fact. But that doesn't mean that lone actors don't come from a hive of activity, oftentimes online, a network of support. It doesn't have to be one or the other. For example, another one that I know has been a critique in some conservative media is that around mental illness, right? And I think the last thing that anybody responsible should do is stigmatize people with mental illness. And if we turn the telescope around, we know that 1 in 20 million people that suffers from mental illness resorts to violence, okay? That can be true, and at the same time, some of these lone actors can be overrepresented in terms of having mental illnesses or challenges. So to me, I tend to think that being nuanced in our understanding of it not being either or is important, but at the same time sticking to our guns and saying, this is what we define the radical right as, or the far right, there are different terms for it. This is why we define it like this, and these actors are coming from these types of fever swamps, frankly. And I think that we, in some cases, have to stick to our guns and say, that's what it is.
So I'm gonna put my mom hat on and say, yeah, I have 2 teenage boys, and actually earlier I was thinking about, you know, the whole Reddit space, which has become quite the spawning ground for a lot of misogyny and racism and so on. And so I think, you know, and plus the gaming space, you know, the gaming space is something that we need to address, because, you know, if you're talking about young people, they're not reading the news. You know, they're getting their news from, they don't even go on Facebook anymore. So I don't know where they get, my boys listen to NPR with me, so they're stuck. But I think the typical, you know, especially young male, is not really, we have to figure out ways to reach them. And so that comes back to the earlier question. I think if we can find ways to get to these kids when they're, you know, from middle school through high school, that's where the really formative ideas are happening. And if we can, you know, somehow find a way to get into that gaming world and have them, you know, understand, you know, what's going on and not saying, you know, not just, you know, doing the shoot 'em ups. I mean, you know, I understand the research says that doing the shoot 'em up games doesn't make them violent, but I think it can feed into a lot of the issues that we're seeing with these young men and their grievances, really.
I mean, one kind of related point is that we often, now we think of kind of conventional media and social media, it's perhaps not a point in terms of prevention, because I think I'd still stand by that point of better kind of education of journalists about these issues. I was reminded of that, particularly about the coverage of the Christchurch attacks, because a lot of the manifesto, which I haven't read, I've only heard commentaries by other analysts, was the online culture which enabled the attacker, and some of the references in there which have gone completely over journalists' heads. He was referring to video games. He was saying, "Oh, I learned all this by playing Spyro 3, which is about like a really cute dragon or something," and it is part of that kind of ironic and satirical kind of humour. So I think education in terms of prevention is the best. But just to kind of extend that point a bit more, radical right actors now can bypass the media, the mainstream media completely. And we also saw that in terms of the Christchurch attack, because as Matthew said, he was able to live stream it on a social media platform, and we've seen other in the UK, other radical right influencers using that function when doorstepping journalists or going into mosques as well. So it's the scary thing is, that's a very dark note to kind of end on, is how we engage with some of these things which are outside of the mainstream media, and that's probably the responsibility of mainly social media companies to really get on top of these live streams, plus when they are kind of recognised. But obviously that is a quagmire, because then you think about kind of freedom of speech and stuff like that. Obviously if it's a hateful action, it needs to be restricted.
Just a kind of to come back on that, I think that's an important point, but also to, I hope, respond to what Ahmed was saying there. There's a sort of all-out assault on experts and specialists the world over. And I think that one of the things that perhaps is incumbent on those specialists is, insofar as they are possible, to leave their politics at the door and make it evidence-led. And I hope that when I engage the media, it's based on my experience looking at these things, and it's based on my knowledge of the evidence that is there. That being said, I do a fair amount of work with the media, most of the work because I'm committed to this. I believe it's an issue that needs to be addressed socially. Most of the stuff I do tends to be background, which doesn't necessarily come up on highlight reels or whatever, because I think that is part of the job of being a dispassionate expert. All that being said, I still wonder, and it comes back to an important question that was raised here earlier, about us still tending to maybe preach to the choir a little bit. And we've talked about this before. I'm guessing most people in the audience can think of what they might think of as a pretty right-wing media. I'm not talking about far right, I'm thinking about right-wing mainstream media. And that wouldn't be a normal venue for us to choose to necessarily appear and talk about these things in. maybe we should rethink that. I'd like to think that those journalists or representatives of those media could meet us halfway and say, look, we're not going to bash you as some sort of, you know, loony left liberal or something like that when you're trying to talk facts. That might be a bit quixotic of me to think that that's possible. But at the same time, I think that maybe moving out of our comfort zone, whether that's progressive or left-wing media, because they address these things and others don't, I still haven't thought this through, but it seems to me that perhaps people better than I, talking to, in this case, kind of conservative or even populist media, you know, level, patient, information-led, empirical way, is a really important thing, rather than turning our backs on them and saying that's their echo chamber, we have ours. That doesn't seem to serve anybody, whether it's right-wing conservative media or its opposite. I haven't cracked how you do that, and maybe my final statement would be an appeal to those representatives of those media, saying, you know, if there's ways that we can search for information and truth together, I think that that's something worth doing. Maybe that would have to start with those representatives of the media recognizing that this is an issue, that this thing does exist, and perhaps starting on that basis.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I won't mention Donna Brazil and her story into Fox News, but I guess I just did. But anyway, I do think that there are ways to present things in a dispassionate, not, you know, we all have our partisan opinions, but you can do things in a dispassionate way that is trying to offer facts. And I think that the way to get access to those types of media is to do more of what we're doing, right? To say, yes, you know, I'd be happy to write something about how the mainstream right. I mean, I have talked a lot about the mainstream right and the impacts and so on. And so, just to show that we are doing work that is relevant to what they are interested in. And so, I just think you're right. You know, we need to be open-minded. I think we should be sending them our op-eds.
So at the risk of ending on a negative note, and also a total self-serving question, because my own provost is in the audience here, our new provost, Dan Myers. I wonder if, you know, we've been talking about what universities can do, both on the student side and also on the knowledge side, but given the risks that scholars take in this area to be public, are there things that universities should be doing to better protect scholars who, some of whom, you know, have had to take leaves of absences, had terrible trolling, have FBI involved in, you know, friends of ours, right? We've all had friends of ours who've had threats to their kids, threats to their families for doing these kinds of public events. And so I wonder if you have thoughts about what are the best proactive or reactive strategies on the part of university leaders to better protect their own scholars who engage publicly on divisive issues.
I would say the first step is to listen to your faculty when they're telling you that they're getting threats, but I'm sure here they do. But I've heard stories of faculty who weren't listened to, and by the time any action was taken, it's gotten really far. And we had a situation where a faculty member at Miller College there were some folks going after her, and you know what we did is we said, first of all, we believe you. You have academic freedom, and you have the right to be out there saying what you want to say, and we'll do whatever we need to do to help make sure your emails and act and things like that. And so, actually, I've actually looked into this quite a bit. There are people out there who have found ways to get into email, do all kinds of things, and expose doxing, etc. And so I think as academic leaders, we need to be prepared for that. And so that's why I've actually looked into this issue, to follow what's happening, make sure, at least when I was provost, that I understood what some of the tactics were that people who want to attack faculty were taking. But I think as academic leaders, we really have to just be prepared that it's not going to end. People have agendas and they're going to go after people. But I think another step is to educate faculty about when they should consider something a threat versus just somebody sending a nasty email or something like that. I doubt there's hardly any of the faculty out there who haven't got the nasty email or something, similar to that. But it's figuring out what's a threat and what isn't. And so there's a lot of resources out there now because of what's been happening. And it's not just faculty; it's people in the across the spectrum are getting attacked for various reasons.
I guess maybe slightly more ponderous than Terry's point, which was direct and right to the quick of the issue, is to me a more general question. Should humanistic knowledge be shared? Humanities and more broadly, a humanistic education is for everyone. Should it be hoarded by a university, or should it be shared from the society of which it's a part? Inquiries into ourselves as a society, as individuals, as nation states, what have you. I emphatically believe that knowledge should be shared. And if we believe that knowledge should be shared, the question becomes, how do we facilitate it? How do we lift up the people who are doing the sharing? Not everybody is comfortable doing that sharing, and I certainly don't think that there should be any punitive responses. But if a university says, we don't want to hoard this information, we want to share it because we are part of this society. We're not aside from it or above it or to the side of it. And if that's the case, and I tend to think there is some self-selection going on, individuals within that university say, I would like to speak out, or I would like to add to the store of human knowledge through this vector or this venue or this approach, then I think then the questions become much more practical. How do we do that? How do we facilitate that? How do we troubleshoot problems that come up? And those, I think, if we start from our basic principles, that humanistic knowledge should not be hoarded and that should be shared in the society in which it's a part, some of the other questions rather fall into place.
What thoughts on that, or closing thoughts in general?
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk attached to studying these groups. I mean, I've very fortunately been on more comical bits of trolling on Twitter. One actor is calling me a numpty, which in the UK is kind of like criminal idiot. So I thought it's very humorous. But yeah, I think there's a more serious point about kind of protections that can be afforded and realities about some of the repercussions. So yeah, I think again it's part of education, faculty knowing some of the risks, and being able to perhaps limit the amount of public information within reason on a scholar, or just kind of believing some of these facts is quite important.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I know if folks have individual questions, you're welcome to come up for a few minutes before I have to take our panelists onward to our next appointment. But I want to thank you all for coming and thank our partner Rant Media for live streaming and all of our co-sponsors and everyone in the audience virtually as well for being a part of this Global Education Forum on the Radical Right in Higher Education globally. So thank you to our panelists.